Dune Part 2 has captured my imagination in a particular way that no other film truly has. I'm not saying it's my favorite movie of all time or that it's the greatest cinematic achievement to ever exist, but all I know is that I've now spent nearly 2 months of my life writing over 40,000 words about it, making not one but 2 labor-intensive fan art pieces, and posting a video on YouTube about it. I've never done that for any other movie. Maybe I only feel this way because Dune Part 2 came into my life at exactly the perfect time. When I first watched it, I was going through an intense rediscovery of my creative passions anyway. But still, I get a fickle, transient urge to do projects like this all the time, and this is the first one I've ever completely followed through on. So that indicates to me that Dune Part 2 must be a pretty special experience. I'm grateful to Dune Part 2 for giving me something to get so creatively fired up about. At some point in the future, I'll probably end up reading all the books and becoming a diehard Dune head. But for now, I'm going into this with only the limited knowledge I have currently. I feel that's actually not a bad position to examine a film from, for a couple of reasons. When we look at analyses of this kind, we presume that going deep into the content means going deep into the lore, the history, the far-stretching outer reaches of the content's universe. Take Lord of the Rings, for example. The superfans are the people who have read everything Tolkien has ever written. They make a yearly tradition of marathoning all the extended cuts. Their room is probably full of merchandise that expresses their devotion to that fandom. There's nothing wrong with that, and honestly, power to those people. This video will, in fact, later on heavily champion the idea of allowing yourself to be a superfan of something you love. But I'm bringing up this point to say that I think there is still a place for, and arguably an underutilized place for, engaging critically with simply how one isolated film, like Return of the King for instance, functions as its own piece of art, examining how it uses cinematic language effectively, or maybe how it could be used more effectively, to tell each little beat of the story, appreciating how it makes you feel as a viewer, acknowledging that all other canonical content before it still contributes to the big moments of payoff, but focusing on the fact that none of that matters unless this movie is able to succeed in making you feel something on its own merit. A success or lack thereof, which is fully determined by the filmmaker's understanding and application of what it means to make a good film and to tell a good story. I aim to ask similar questions about what Dune Part 2 achieves as its own movie in isolation. Another reason that I think my limited context could be a good place to start from is because I think it's a mistake to overlook the importance of the casual viewer experience. There's that saying that a writer starts a story but the reader finishes it. In that sense, a film is not merely what happens within the 2 hours or so of runtime as captured on camera. The film doesn't happen on the wall that the footage is projected onto. It happens as that projection is reflected into the eyes of each person viewing it. So that gets into one of the interesting things that occurs when we have a movie like Dune 2. It's pretty unquestionably a piece of real art, but it's also a box office hit, which is grossing upwards of $500 million globally. That's a lot of people who have now seen Dune Part 2, and many more to come. So why is the film that's projected into the eyes of an expert more important than the film projected into the eyes of some farmer who says, "Yeah, I sure do like that Denis Villeneuve," or some teenage girl who watches it just because she thinks Timothée Chalamet is cute? I appreciate and admire the people who have been moderating Dune fan forums for longer than I've been alive, but the vast majority of people who saw this film are not that person. And the question occurred to me of whether the following statement should be considered true or false. A good film is a film which is good even to a viewer who goes into it knowing nothing about it. This occurred to me as I was watching this movie the second time with my parents who hadn't even seen Part 1. In the back of my mind, I was conscious the whole time about what would and wouldn't be confusing to them, since I wanted them to enjoy this thing I love that I'm now showing them, and this theater which I now feel responsible for dragging them into. Even with the simplest stories you can imagine, there are still countless different ways to tell that story, countless different approaches to take based on subjective and personalized evaluations of what is and isn't important. It is my belief that, for whatever reason, Villeneuve simply gets Dune. When I say that, I don't necessarily mean that he matches Frank Herbert's vision closer than other directors could. I'm also not necessarily saying that he told this story better than Frank Herbert did. What I am saying is that Villeneuve approaches this subject matter with a clarity of vision that makes the very quintessence of Dune feel even Dunier than ever before. He got to the core. He extracted that core with a precision that's almost almost like when a specialized robot has to perform a surgery because it's too delicate for human hands. If I were to wipe Lynch's Dune and Villeneuve's Dune out of my memory and then ask myself how I would go about adapting Frank Herbert's novel into a film, it would look much different than theirs. If you did that, it would look much different than theirs too, and different than mine. In fact, I'm suggesting that everybody go do this as a creative exercise. Take a novel you love, it doesn't have to be Dune, and think about how you would adapt it. Pretend that you have all the resources you could ever want and billions of dollars at your disposal. Or if you feel overwhelmed by unlimited possibilities, imagine you have a small budget and minimal resources. Think way too hard about it. Put an impractical amount of thought and care into planning out each scene. Ignore the notion that it is impractical to do so when you're never going to get the chance to actually make this film. The reason I say to do this is because I feel it will probably teach invaluable lessons about what it takes to actually tell a story and tell it well. You are forced to get to the core of what is meaningful and enthralling about a story in print, and then you're forced to figure out how to translate that into movie form. You'll also most likely realize that it's a lot more difficult than it seems. Making an adapted screenplay is a lot more complicated and artful than simply copying and pasting over the written source material into script format. You have to restructure it, and in order to do that, it becomes a trial in seeing the forest for the trees and the trees for the forest. It requires this high level of abstract cognition, which is its own type of genius. I believe that type of genius is something that can be developed and strengthened by anyone, but it's still a type of genius which is rare and exceptional. It's definitely something I struggle with in my own writing. I know that structure, flow, and sticking to the point are aspects of writing I would like to improve at. I know that Dune Part 2 handled these aspects perfectly, in my opinion, and so I want to study and learn from this example. I truly believe you could go scene by scene through this movie and see that every single one achieves a crucial purpose. I would also argue that the order that these scenes happen in, and the length and pacing of each scene, all contribute to this wonderful effect where information and emphasis is given and withheld at all the right moments to perfectly capture our attention and keep us engaged from start to finish. In the hope of illustrating this, I'm going to start with trying to dissect the first act of the movie. I think it's equally important and perhaps more difficult to maintain engagement throughout subsequent acts, but I want to focus on the beginning, at least for right now, because I personally would really like to understand what it was about Dune Part 2 that made me immediately sold on it. What drew me in? What about it captivated me? This seems like a weird place to start, but I'm actually going to dive in by pinpointing the one little moment when I first had a complaint. Just the slightest semblance of questioning the vision. One tiny slip in my suspension of disbelief. If I have one nitpick as far as characters doing things that don't feel super believable for their character, it would be that Paul never brings up the fact that Lady Jessica is pregnant prior to the Water of Life ritual. I guess I can understand why Jessica didn't mention it, but it seems weird to me that Paul never said a word about it either. Just a few scenes prior, we saw Paul asking if she's okay, and then also asking if the baby is okay. We know that he is concerned about his unborn sister, and doesn't overlook that concern even in the middle of desperate and dangerous situations. The first lines Paul says in the movie are him directly speaking to Aaliyah. I can see why Paul doesn't make some huge fuss about it in front of everyone, but when Jessica is explaining the ritual to Paul in a private conversation between the two of them, it seems like Paul would probably simply ask, is that going to do anything weird to the baby? Maybe it's that Paul knows that it somehow plays into the prophecy for Aaliyah to get all the knowledge of a reverend mother, but if that's the case, I would almost expect Paul to be even more critical of this decision. Not only is that a brutally traumatizing thing to inflict on Aaliyah as a tiny fetus, I would expect for it to strike a personal nerve with Paul as someone who resents the way his mother has forced him into taking on the role of the Kwisatz Haderach, a job he never asked for. Maybe this is something that would make more sense with context from the books, but my point is that I felt a little confused about this detail based on how it was presented in the movie. I've thought it through some more, and it's understandable, I suppose, mostly because Stilgar explains that Jessica is going to be real dead real fast if she doesn't do the ritual. With that in mind, it's easier to understand why Jessica agrees to do it, and even why Paul fails to mention her pregnancy as well. Despite whatever concern Paul has about the baby, he knows that if Jessica dies, the baby is going to die also. He's willing to be tactful about the situation because he knows that's the only way there's a possibility that they both live. I do think it was very wrong and very inhumane to put that fetus through the Water of Life ritual. That ritual violently forced a consciousness upon a being that was not supposed to have a consciousness yet. Not only a consciousness, singular, but keep in mind also the memories, the knowledge, and the pain of countless other souls. The water of life is something that most full-grown adults cannot withstand because it is so incomprehensibly overwhelming. Aaliyah went through all of that before she had even opened her eyes to the world for the first time. No, worse, before she even had fully formed eyes. My God, if that isn't just the craziest, most horrific concept you've ever heard in your life. And I truly mean horror. I don't know what the term is for the type of horror you find in stuff like I have no mouth and I must scream. Like existential horror, maybe? Some overlap with body horror, I guess, but it's almost like out-of-body horror. Whatever that is, the stuff with Aaliyah is the epitome of that. But it also has elements of the kind of horror that black metal bands write lyrics about. Witchy, occult, satanic ritual gone horribly wrong vibes. Abomination is one of those words that has lost meaning because it's used too much about things that aren't truly abominations. But this is a true abomination in the purest sense of the word, because of how radically it defiles, profanes, and violates nature. It's not natural for this much consciousness to exist within a bodily vessel that is not even equipped to handle one consciousness yet. It's the metaphysical equivalent of something that defies the laws of physics. Like if you could somehow fit an ocean's worth of water into a little hip flask. An analogy that comes to mind because it would make life on Arrakis a whole lot easier. I still think it's slightly unbelievable that it wasn't until halfway through the ritual that any mention is made of the fact that Jessica's pregnant. But it doesn't even really matter because it allows for one of my favorite scenes in the movie. This is an example of something that I might have handled differently if I was directing this movie. I would get too hung up on the detail that Paul probably would have said something realistically, but I can totally acknowledge that the result here is far better than whatever I would have come up with. Honestly, Lady Jessica's Water of Life scene might be my personal favorite scene. I actually don't know what I would say the best one is, but I guess it would probably be a good thought exercise to figure that out. Probably the most popular answer would be Paul riding the sandworm. But anyways, I think my personal favorite is this ritual. I don't have much deeper reason besides simply that I just like it. It just kind of scratches a particular itch for me in terms of things that I find interesting and aesthetically compelling. I think the Bene Gesserit are so goddamn cool. Not in like a glorifying way, because I know they're bad, but they're still cool. A lot of that comes from their aesthetic. I wish I could find any of these drawings, but as a kid, I remember obsessively drawing the costumes for Padme/Amidala. That's why I wanted to make these two Irulan portraits, specifically because I see the Bene Gesserit costuming as being like an edgier, elevated version of those outfits that I adored so much as a kid. So the Bene Gesserit style is exactly all I could have ever wanted. There's a lot more than that which I find fascinating about the Bene Gesserit, but that's a topic I'll hold off on for now. I think it's also true that I love this ritual scene because of the function it serves as the second scene of the film, which has you on the edge of your seat, filled with suspense and drama that pushes the story forward. I think back to the recent memory of sitting in the movie theater watching Dune for the first time, and then also the second time, and this scene sticks out to me because it's what truly straps me in and then gives me a little kiss on my forehead as I embark on the ride that is this nearly 3-hour journey. When you're telling a story, it's important to have that hook, that thing early on which pulls the audience in and catches their attention and intrigue. In Dune Part 2, I would say it's the fight scene with the Harkonnen soldiers in the black helmets that achieves that hook. That fight is a thrilling action sequence, and it does an excellent job of building and holding suspense, but it also does so many other things at the same time, which I'll talk about in a moment. I don't think I'm alone in saying that it was the shot where the soldiers ascend into the air and float up the side of that rock formation when I got this feeling like, oh wow, this is going to be good. The reason I feel so fondly towards the ritual scene is because it gave me that feeling of, wow, this is going to continue to be good. There are so many times when someone will know how to start a story well, times when I get super hyped up for the movie I'm about to watch or the book I'm about to read, and then it becomes increasingly disappointing as the story keeps going. There's probably lots of explanations for this. One possibility is more cynical, like maybe storytellers know that the beginning is their pitch to the audience. And so if they can just sell the audience on the beginning, they don't have to try as hard after that. Another explanation is that the storytellers are not being intentionally manipulative or scummy about anything. but simply they themselves approach making a story by starting at the beginning, and eventually they lose steam or don't know where to go with the good ideas they had. Regardless, going back to everything I said about how no other piece of media has captured my imagination and sense of wonder like this in a long time, I really hate it when I start to feel that and get my hopes up that something is going to be my new favorite thing, and then not long after that I have to begrudgingly accept that I'm starting to get bored. My thoughts are drifting elsewhere, and I'm starting to get that impatient urge to get up and do something else. I find myself aware of and wondering about how much longer the movie is. That never happened while watching Dune Part 2, and with my ADD being as strong as it is, it's legitimately miraculous for me to watch a 3-hour movie and be enthralled the whole time. Of course, it's entitled and whiny to complain that some movie which cost billions of dollars and would have made people 40 years ago poop their pants is a bit dull for my liking. But still, I'd argue that it's a slightly different thing. When I get my hopes up thinking that a movie is totally going to become this life-changing, transcendent experience, and then I eventually realize that it just fails to deliver on that. So I think the reason this second plot-driving action scene of Dune Part 2 is special to me is because it gave me a wonderfully reassuring feeling. As if to say, no, you're actually just going to keep getting more captivated as the movie goes on, not less. Now, going back to the actual beginning of the film, there are a few more things I want to talk about. I mentioned the hook of this movie and the importance of capturing the audience's interest early on. It doesn't have to literally be the first scene that does this, and in Dune 2 it isn't. In fact, Villeneuve makes a debatably risky choice by starting the film with relatively dry exposition and setting up a framing device with Irulan's diaries. This is something taken from the novel, and it's also how the novel starts, as I recall. But I think it's a little risky to start off this way, especially considering that a lot of people complained that they couldn't get into both Part 1 and the novel because they felt it was too boring. Hollywood is plagued by bigwigs sacrificing the quality and integrity of storytelling because they're trying to please everyone, trying to make as much money as possible, and therefore bending the knee to every little complaint made about their product, frequently doing so in ways that seem quite mindlessly out of touch. I know it's an untrue exaggeration to suggest that anybody might watch the short opening monologue of Part 2 and be like, what's this bitch yapping about? Get to a knife fight already, and leave the theater. But I still think it's worth noting that it's a bit of an odd choice to frame the story in this way. The oddest thing about it is that it's told from the perspective of the hero's wife. Not even his true love, but his wife from a political marriage. Someone who gets relatively very little screen time. A character who most people will refer to as Florence Pugh instead of the character's name. That's the point of view from which this story is supposedly told? Why is that? If there was any framing device or expository narration, we'd expect it from Paul. Since I believe that Chani is the true hero of the story, I guess it's possible but still less expected that we might get it from her. I'm glad it wasn't Chani because it would start to feel too much like Winona Ryder and Edward Scissorhands or Rose in Titanic, the trope where the now-aged female love interest in distracting elderly makeup is poignantly reminiscing about her great love that didn't work out. There are examples where the exposition is delivered more like we're glimpsing into the oral tradition of telling and retelling these legends over generations, and therefore the narrator seems to be chosen based on whose voice sounds the most like what you would expect from a fairy tale. Usually a deep-voiced old man, or it might also be an ethereal, elf-like woman's voice. A British accent is also often involved. This is the closest comparison to what happens with Irulan's diaries, because we get the sense that these diaries will eventually become one of the source texts for the epic of Paul Muad'Dib Atreides, as it is told and retold throughout history. But already there's some intriguing things going on here. Framing a story by evoking the oral tradition of a myth, having some narrator talk about the legend of so-and-so, that's all very familiar. But this trope is given a little tweak, a little extra flavor, because one of the main themes of Dune is the idea that it's these legends and myths that have the real power. And because of this, they can be very dangerous. I'm not suggesting that Irulan is an unreliable narrator as we typically think of it, but I do think it's smart to evaluate the specificities of Irulan's unique subjective point of view that influences what she says and gives additional context and personal connotation to her words. But there are also other layers to it. Irulan calls these imperial diaries, and although we get some of the more confessional personal details, such as her description of her father's guilt, this is not the same raw romantic diary of with womanhood that we might see in a Jane Austen novel. Irulan is primarily concerned with her role as a would-be empress, and it appears she keeps these diaries as a means of documenting empirical happenings. Perhaps this is something she's been asked to do as one of her princess duties, but it seems to me that Irulan keeps these records out of her own fascination with politics. She desires to play a part in these politics, and she knows that in order to do that, she needs to understand what's going on and understand it better than anyone else if she wants to be a truly great empress or Bene Gesserit's sister, maybe even eventually Bene Gesserit mother. That's why she keeps these diaries, because she's a keen observer of the powers that be. And we also can't forget that she's already involved with the Bene Gesserit. And so it's important to question where there is an overlap between what Irulan says as a keen observer of politics and what she says out of her Bene Gesserit affiliation, a clandestine order of propaganda masters. From her diaries, I personally get the sense that Irulan's interests lie with the empirical politics more than she has any interest in spreading Bene Gesserit propaganda. Typically, if we found out a politician was a member of some cult, we would scrutinize their words and policies because it's presumable that they would be furthering the interests of this cult. With Irulan, it appears that she's a politician first and a Bene Gesserit second. So it almost seems like rather than being used as a puppet of the Bene Gesserit herself, Irulan might be using her Bene Gesserit insider status simply as a means of gaining even greater insights and therefore attaining even greater political influence. Another important decision Villeneuve and Spates had to make with this screenplay is figuring out how to pick up where they left off. The decision was made to truncate the amount of time Paul and Jessica spend with the Fremen, which again, that was probably the right decision, but again, it just probably wasn't how I would have done it. It's neat that we pick up right where we left off, and that makes this feel more like a legitimate second part than a sequel. I'm not complaining about anything being left out, because the Dune novel and both of these films are so jam-packed with fascinating, important content that it's truly impressive how much didn't get left out or feel rushed. All I'm saying is that in my notes I wrote down a question that I presumed was simply logistical, just for the sake of being clear on the context. How much time has passed since the end of part 1? But when I started idly thinking about it the next day, I got caught up in imagining this whole sort of interquill scenario, also called a midquill, but if you grew up with the same direct-to-DVDs that I did, you probably think of it as a Lion King 1.5 between the sequel or behind-the-scenes quill scenario. Once I started thinking about the in-between time, all I could think was, damn, it probably really sucked for Paul to have to carry Jamas's corpse through the desert. Imagine how shameful, haunting, and frankly awkward that would be. You just met these people who are already distrustful of you and treat you like an unwelcome outsider, but you need their help because you'll almost certainly die out here in this unforgiving desert without them. So they begrudgingly decide to help you. But then you're challenged to a duel by one of them, and then you kill him, and now you and your mom have to travel for miles with these people on foot while dragging behind the body of the guy that you just killed. That sounds like a nightmare for many reasons. Carrying any heavy, bulky, dead weight, literally, through the Arrakis desert would be such a pain in the ass anyways. But also, talk about an elephant in the room. You know how when you're in someone's house for the first time, you get that crushing anxiety that you're going to do something wrong? And then you're so nervous that you end up just being annoying. Oh no, I don't see a coaster, but it would be rude to set my drink down on their table without a coaster, so I'm just going to keep awkwardly holding this bottle of beer all night, but I also don't want to finish it because I don't want to tell them that this beer tastes nasty. Then you just make it worse than it ever had to be in the first place, because after 3 hours of holding that half-full bottle in your lap, you forgot it was there, and now you spilled it on their couch, and now you wish you were never born. Now imagine that the people you're with are people with entirely different customs and etiquette than your own, so all of the imaginable scenarios of ways that you could possibly offend them explode into the millions as you consider possibilities that don't even make sense. Possibilities like, oh no, maybe in their culture yawning makes me seem like a pervert. Where do they stand on shoe tying? Is that cool, or should I excuse myself to go do that privately? Now imagine that the sun is beating down and everyone's tired, hungry, and thirsty, so that all adds up to the irritability levels skyrocketing. Not to mention that literally making one wrong step could kill everyone, because this is a pretty spot-on analogy to walking on eggshells. Except instead of breaking an eggshell, a monster comes through the floor and eats all of you. Now imagine if the first time you went over to somebody's house, they asked you to help them move their expensive new furniture. A task which can get even the best of friends yelling, "No, you go that way. Can't you lift it any higher on your side? Watch the shelf, watch the shelf, watch the shelf." Except the new furniture is their friend that you just stabbed to death right in front of them. Even the fact that your mom is there for some reason makes us feel even more like the epitome of a bizarre anxiety nightmare. Jessica and Paul definitely already have some of that strained single mom and her teenage son struggling to relate with one another dynamic. That's being pushed even further because now it's like when somebody brings you as their plus one to an event where they don't know anybody either. So the whole night, the two of you are making strained conversation because that's somehow less uncomfortable than separating from each other and mingling. You'd probably need to avoid mingling even more when everyone there actually does kind of hate you. And it's not just the paranoid, everybody here probably hates me delusion. Also, have you ever had that thing where your mom is interacting with people you know and you're like, please don't embarrass me? But then you have this surreal, oh, how the tables have turned role reversal, where you're around people that she knows and you pick up the vibe that she's possibly nervous about you embarrassing her. It's one of those humanizing realizations, realizing your parents are just people too. But it's also like, what the hell, Mom? I'm cool. I'm fun. I'm about to be the highlight of this funeral for a coworker of yours. I know this isn't true to their dynamic in the film, but it's funny for me to picture Lady Jessica, the worldly Bene Gesserit, anticipating this first encounter with the Fremen and thinking, Paul's never had to deal with this kind of diplomacy before, but he'll be okay. He's got a good head on his shoulders. He's Leto's son after all. He'll be fine. Oh, and he just stabbed that guy. Don't forget about the elephant in the room aspect I mentioned earlier, because there's also the fact that Jessica knows that her son has just lost his murder virginity, and she's justifiably worried about what that's doing to him psychologically. So I picture her trying to casually slip it into the conversation, hoping that her son might open up about it, and then Paul yelling, Mom, God, I don't want to talk about it, okay? God, you're so annoying. As far as my own creative wheelhouse is concerned, I can only dream of ever approximating the grandeur and majesty of Villeneuve's directing style and vision. But hey Universal, let me know if you have any interest in finding someone to reimagine the Dune universe as a twee, darkly comedic, Little Miss Sunshine-esque interquill. I might be just the girl for that job. Hit me up if you want to talk business. Okay, joking aside, the biggest challenge that Paul faces between Part 1 and Part 2 is that Paul is forced to contend with the guilt of taking a human life for the first time. You can't get much more on the nose in terms of representing that cinematically than having him carry the weight of that man's body to his final resting place. This is important not only for the development of Paul's character as he confronts this brutal loss of innocence and must behold the blood on his hands for the first time, but it's also important to the plot, especially since we know that Paul will one day have the blood of billions of people on his hands. That knowledge becomes even more tragic when we see that he was once just a scared little boy being forced to do something that he didn't want to do, and going through intense inner turmoil from killing someone. This adds a lot of depth to an element of the film which some people found confusing and superfluous, the recurring visions of Jamis as a mentor figure to Paul. It's true that part of Paul's prescience is the ability to see many different timelines, if you will. So there likely was, or rather would have been, a timeline in which Jamis was not killed, but instead became Paul's, senpai or whatever. But out of all of these possible timelines, why does Villeneuve decide to devote precious screen time to a few scattered, brief visions of Senpai Jamis? My interpretation is that it demonstrates Paul's guilt, and I think it also humanizes him in a very believable way, because this is one of those irrationally sentimental things that humans do. Maybe you've encountered this before or know someone who's done this. A person dies and you don't know anything about them, and you've maybe never even met them, but the story of their death makes you feel sad. So you find yourself Googling their name and trying to learn more about them, who they were, what happened, the loved ones they're leaving behind. It's something that I call irrationally sentimental, but very human, because it doesn't help anything. It's not like you can know this person at all, especially not now that they're no longer here. If anything, it's just actively making things worse through this pitiful exercise and seeking out something that's just going to make you more sad. But we do these things nevertheless for no other reason than that it feels wrong to think that someone could just suddenly no longer be alive, without as many people remembering and grieving them as possible. And you can tell yourself that this is in some way honoring the dead, celebrating their life and their memory, that you hope the same would be done for you if you passed away. But that's the thing, this is all for you. You can't truly miss or grieve this person in the same way you would a loved one. You can have a genuine feeling of empathy for their loved ones. You can feel a sense of pathos and poignancy in the same way that the Greeks noticed you could feel this way about something that isn't happening to you personally. and then they came up with the tragedy as a genre. But ultimately, the best explanation for that urge we get to basically internet stalk some stranger who passed away is because we do this as a way to peek into the overwhelming notion of our own mortality. It's easier to do this with the level of emotional distance that comes from not knowing the person who died. As if this is just an amuse-bouche from a charcuterie board of existential dread, and we're simply picking it up to nibble on it and see what we think. I've never personally had an experience where I was responsible for someone's death, but I can imagine how this already arguably unhealthy fascination could become a deeply unhealthy form of self-punishment. Imagine if you had accidentally killed someone, or imagine you thought you might have accidentally led to their death, even if that's simply regretting that you didn't intervene sooner or intervene differently. Maybe you don't have to imagine, and I'm truly sorry if that's the case. For Paul, I think this absolutely does become a form of self-punishment. Paul can instead replay visions of the life that Jamis could have lived if Paul hadn't killed him. Granted, it mostly seems that Paul doesn't have control over the visions he gets, so this is more like him being haunted by a ghost or haunted by a recurring nightmare. It's not exactly like the analogy of someone reading an obituary over and over, or replaying a voicemail over and over, as a means of making themselves sad on purpose. But I would still argue that this is Paul's psyche attacking itself in some way. If Paul puts himself through this kind of punishment over killing one person, imagine what it's doing to him knowing that he's probably going to be responsible for literally billions of deaths. In a tragic and twisted way, Jamis still is a mentor figure to Paul. Jamis taught Paul how to kill. I know that most people probably don't care about the same things that I care about with regard to the beginning of this film, so I'll talk briefly about what is probably the true hook as it was intended, the opening fight scene. This is the first big action sequence, and it's a really good action sequence, but it's also more than that. Often it seems like the people behind movies and shows believe they need as much action as possible, otherwise the audience will get bored. That approach interferes with so much writing that could otherwise be good. It could be good if the writers or executives or whomever weren't so obviously terrified about losing their audience's approval every time they go more than 5 minutes without expensive CGI-filled spectacle. But Dune Part 2 demonstrates how and why it is so very possible to tell a compelling story that is also an audiovisual spectacle, one that takes full advantage of all the magic that the film medium is capable of. Something that's crowd-pleasing and excites the imagination and excites the senses and gets you fired up in the unique way that only a truly stimulating film can. Right from the start, the first fight scene shows us that. It's a mesmerizing, pulse-pounding action sequence, but what makes it also such a great scene is that it works on many other levels. There are many other things being achieved simultaneously alongside and even through that action as a narrative device. It furthers the world building by showing not only the inventive technology imagined for this film, but also the world building of how these two different armies fight, both the Harkonnen and the Fremen. The Harkonnen fight naively. When standing in the desert with sandworms beneath your feet, the obvious choice would be to get to higher ground. But that's because they don't know the desert like the Fremen do. The Fremen called the sandworms probably knowing the Harkonnen would try to get to higher ground, and then the Fremen can easily snipe them down one by one, like shooting fish in a barrel. It shows that the Fremen are not afraid to do that, and later when they drain one of the captured soldiers alive, and then we see a sandworm consuming all their corpses, it shows something about the customs of their tribe. Taking the moisture from the defeated Harkonnen soldiers does kind of fall into the use all parts of the buffalo stereotype that is often used in depictions of non-white tribes of people in fiction to show how mystical and earthy they are. But I don't think that's a particularly negative stereotype. It's just smart to use all parts of the buffalo. The fact that the Fremen are able to survive on Arrakis is because they are extremely resourceful and have learned to utilize their environment in whatever way they can. Another trope we often see when writers are depicting or coding a tribe of colonized people is that they're docile pacifists with respect and honor for all living things. But we see that this is not the case with the Fremen because, that one soldier was definitely still alive as Chani turns him into a raisin, and I have to imagine it would have been a lot more honorable to mercy kill him first. It also shows where Paul and Lady Jessica are at in their character development since we left them in the desert at the end of part 1. Jessica is not prissy about killing a dude if she has to. We saw this in the first film, but we get a gentle reminder of that when we see her smash a Harkonnen skull to dust. Self-defense turned to excessive violence like this is generally a hint that the character is either terrified, has an evil streak, or both. Paul is still forgetting not to stand with his back to the open, a callback to something that Gurney told him in part 1. I don't really understand why that's important enough to call back to it, but I want to know. It intrigues me. It might be like how the Bene Gesserit whispered to Paul that by knowing their past, he will now be able to see his future. It might be an indication that Paul still has too much naivety and hubris to understand the true stakes of the danger he's in. Or it could even be the opposite. All these lame boomers keep telling him that he's being foolish, but he hasn't gotten killed yet, so obviously they're just being paranoid. I'm mostly kidding with that last one, but the fact that Paul can recognize Gurney's steps, the fact that he knows how to wear the still suit, the fact that he guesses Jessica's pregnant, all of this demonstrates that Paul can sense things, and that he's generally right to trust what he senses. Or at least he has been right so far. You could call that intuition, or you could attribute that to prescience, or you could just call it being lucky. But regardless, it gives Paul a sense of security that may do more harm than good for him ultimately. And of course, the shot where the soldiers start floating, I mean, wow. I know I'm not the only one who got this, electrifying chill of legitimate awe when I saw that. I made a comparison between Denis Villeneuve and Steven Spielberg on my first viewing, and I'm not even, the world's biggest, most diehard Spielberg fan. But I think in both of their films, you get a sense that they have a true understanding that films are uniquely capable of using spectacle to create emotion. And they know how to utilize that spectacle really well. I and many other people got literal chills seeing those kids lift into the air on their bikes in E.T. I and many other people got literal chills seeing those soldiers levitate up the side of a big rock. Maybe that's a secret hack for getting your audience to feel like you're a wizard. Just make somebody float up into the air unexpectedly. There's just something about it, man. On that note, this seems like as good a place as any to bring up a quote from Villeneuve that caused quite a stir. Dialogue is for theater and television. I don't remember movies because of a good line. I remember movies because of a strong image. I'm not interested in dialogue at all. Pure image and sound, that is the power of cinema. But it is something not obvious when you watch movies today. I know that Villeneuve is likely exaggerating for the sake of having a more standout, headline-worthy quote in the interview. I'm sure he realizes that's good for publicity, and will also bring awareness to and get people talking about what he views as an issue in contemporary filmmaking. I'm not, mad about this quote. I'm not oh no, how could my beloved hero say something that I don't agree with? But I do find it intriguing trying to solve the apparent contradiction of how someone can be one of my favorite directors. How his films can be so inspiring to me in a way where it almost feels like they were designed to appeal to me personally. And yet we seem to have a fundamentally opposite view about this major aspect of storytelling. I'm obsessed with dialogue. If I recommend a TV show to you, you can bet that it's going to be because I think it has great dialogue. When I remember a movie, I do almost always remember it because of a good line. I still have pages from some of my earliest stories I wrote as a child where you can see I wrote it more like a script. With the character's name, their line, the next character's name, their line, and so on. When I was a child, I was reading and inspired by novels, but I don't think I had ever read an actual script at that point. Certainly it wasn't like I was out there reading screenplays for fun. So the only explanation for why I would try to write fiction this way is that I must have thought dialogue was so much more important than descriptive prose, that I was just let's just skip all that crap. I do, however, agree with the notion that art should utilize and take full advantage of the affordances of their mediums, meaning that if a film could just as easily be a book, or if it would maybe even be better that way, it should probably just be a book instead, and vice versa. Maybe Villeneuve's directorial vision speaks to me specifically because he offers such a compelling counterpoint to the things that I would lack or overlook in whatever my own directorial vision would be, in a way that still isn't at odds with the things that I like or find value in. Because he does those things so well that I can't not appreciate it. I think that's actually a valuable trait to look for in mentors and sources of inspiration, in order to ensure that you keep broadening your horizons and balancing out your strengths and weaknesses. Since I've had this lifelong fascination with dialogue, I often find inspiration from writers who excel at dialogue. But if that's all I ever focus on or try to emulate, I'm depriving myself of the chance to develop other strengths in my writing. More importantly, I'm depriving myself of the chance to find beauty and awe in the many other aspects of art that are capable of inspiring that feeling. When we experience something that's done masterfully, but it's not something we normally pay much attention to, it catches us by surprise, and therefore makes a greater impression on us because it comes to us as this novel, revelatory experience. For example, I don't think I've ever geeked out about sound design as much as I did watching part 1. And since then, I've started paying more attention to sound design in anything else I watch. In fact, I want to go all in with this take and turn it into a call to action of some sort. I'm urging you to go and actively seek out sources of inspiration that specifically take something you don't normally care about, but they do it so well that it makes you care. I genuinely believe that's important and will make you more well-rounded and all the better for it. Now that I've had this realization, that's certainly something that I'm going to try to do at least. Not here, though, which is hypocritical, I know, but respectfully, F off. I have 50 pages of essay here about the things that I do normally care about. I got enough on my plate right now as it is. It did help me come to a realization, though, when I was feeling bad about not having more to say during some of the parts of the movie that are more action than dialogue. I realized that the reason I don't have more to say about those scenes is because the takeaways you might have from a well-made action scene are mostly useful to you only if you are hoping to learn how to make a well-made action scene. Whereas analyzing characters and themes has more application to your actual life. This is the case for a lot more than action, too, I realized. I don't have as much to say about the cinematography, the score, and so on, even though they're all excellent, for a few reasons. One, it would just amount to me saying, "Oh, that was so cool, I really liked that part." Two, I don't know enough about things like cinematography or composing a score to have anything more insightful than that to say. Three, I do have some amount of bias that knowledge is less useful to me personally than the things I can utilize to either become a better writer or to become a wiser, more empathetic person. I want to try to lose that bias. I know that I appreciate a strong image from a film, but not in quite the same way that I appreciate a good line. I want to expand my own vision. I don't know how to do that, though, and here's the only solution I could come up with. I want to try taking more time for creative exercises where I pretend that I'm in a role where this knowledge would be useful to me. To pretend that I'm a cinematographer trying to decide what angle is best for a given shot. To pretend that I'm a composer trying to figure out which instrument to use to convey a given emotion. We don't live in a world where adults are given much leeway in which to playfully explore things like this, and that's a shame. But I want to still try to make space for things like this in my life, put effort into things like this. Not because I believe it will ever amount to anything, but simply because I'm hopeful that it might allow me to see beauty I wouldn't have seen otherwise, and to feel alive in ways that I wouldn't have felt otherwise. But I guess I'll move on now to my secondary response to reading this quote from Villeneuve, which is that I find it a little hard to believe. Or I find it surprising, at least, that he feels this way. Because how could someone feel this way when they wrote one of the best goddamn pieces of dialogue I've ever heard? When Paul is talking to Gurney, and Gurney asks, "Because you lose control," and Paul responds, "Because I gain it." Good Lord, that goes so hard. I know there are a lot of people who don't like Villeneuve's dialogue, but I'd say 90% of the time, I think it's pretty impeccable. There are many other screenwriters who I believe do better dialogue, but I think what Villeneuve and Spates wrote for these Dune movies is perfectly suited for this purpose. When people complain about Villeneuvian dialogue, it seems like a common complaint is that it's too direct and obvious. The characters are just telling you exactly what they need to say in order to move the plot along or explain themselves to us in a way that feels unnatural. If you feel this way, that's totally fine, and in fact, there are points in the movie where I fully understand this criticism. I'll give a few examples of quotes and exchanges of dialogue that did indeed strike me as being a little too on the nose. The example that sticks to me the most is when Margot comes back from her mission on Gedi Prime and is giving a debrief to Mother Moyam and Princess Irulan. Because I found it almost comedic, especially when rewatching the film for the purpose of writing about it analytically. I was like, oh nice, that's convenient. She just gave me a full character analysis of Feyd. Thanks, Margot. You can kind of give this a pass, though, because if you're going to do an exposition dump scene, this is exactly the right context to do that. Imagine if in the middle of Margot seducing Feyd, he decided that a good way to rizz her up would be to randomly say, "I am a sociopath of high intelligence. I am driven and cruel. I am strongly motivated by honor. I yearn to be hurt. I love pain. Sure, I probably can't be redeemed, but I can be controlled. I'm sexually vulnerable." However, this is exactly how Margot describes Feyd, so it's not the words that are the problem. Context is what's important. I'm mentioning this just because I want to avoid dealing in absolutes when it comes to calling a piece of writing bad. It's tempting to say that it's always bad to use dialogue to give a comprehensive summary of who a character is supposed to be. It's tempting to say that you should just never do that, period. But if you notice something like this, don't be so quick to immediately dock points and give demerits just because you know the rule is that this thing is bad. There are exceptions to rules. So first ask yourself, is this thing that is usually bad actually appropriate within this context? Sometimes it is. Margot essentially just went on a secret agent honeypot mission for the purpose of gathering intel about Feyd. She did that, and now she is delivering that intel. It also works for her character to do this, because even from her minimal screen time, we see that this robotic, no-nonsense, analytical tone to her delivery is exactly her nature. It might seem like her dry, emotionless persona makes her a flat character, but I think it just demonstrates how devoted she is to the sisterhood, to the point where she is all business and no fun. This makes her surprisingly interesting for a side character, and also sets up Jessica and Irulan as sort of wild cards from Mother Moyam's perspective, because Margot represents the model Bene Gesserit, someone who is dutifully committed to the cause without ever questioning it or getting any crazy ideas of her own. It's sad, honestly, when you remember that she's now pregnant with a psychopath's baby just because someone told her to, and she doesn't even seem fazed by it. Just because Austin Butler has a six-pack, it's not portrayed as particularly tragic that Margot is forced to sleep with him. I mean, that just shows how superficial we all are, am I right? We'd all feel terrible for this woman if she was forced to bang the Baron, but since Feyd has a hot bod, nobody seems to care. She's pregnant with his child now, and all she has to say about it is simply, the bloodline is secured, female as you requested. Contrast this with Jessica and Irulan, who are both depicted at various points questioning and defying Mother Moyam, and showing wills of their own, making them dangerous to the Bene Gesserit order. Irulan doesn't even always do this explicitly, but it's her graceful, reserved way of handling these situations that made her an unexpected favorite character of mine. I love the way that she shows strength simply through listening and observing. Florence Pugh's microexpressions convey so much without her ever needing to say a word. We know that she remains mostly silent in most of these scenes, but not out of meekness or servility. When we see the Harkonnen sex slaves standing in the background, seen and not heard, it's done to show how the Harkonnen objectify and mistreat women, further demonstrating how despicable they are. But when Irulan stands off to the side silently, it's a demonstration of her tactfulness. We know this because we know she has smart opinions. Mother Moyam calls Irulan her most acute student. The Emperor consults her for political advice nearly every time the Emperor is on screen. Irulan guesses that Paul is still alive, all on her own. Usually it seems contrived whenever a character comes to some random epiphany about something that they should not have been able to figure out, given the limited information available to them. But when Irulan makes the connection between the whispers of this legendary Muad'Dib figure and the missing, presumed dead Atreides son, it just shows what good intuition she has, in a way that I personally didn't have any trouble believing. There's a quiet wisdom and grace that Irulan carries. It comes from the fact that she is always closely observing rather than running her mouth, even though she's often the smartest person in the room. It's for this reason, and of course for her incredible fashion sense, that I chose to do portraits of Irulan for my fan art. Because dialogue and even many nonverbal cues are used with great efficiency in this film, it doesn't take much to make even minor characters intriguing. It doesn't take much to show at least a quick glimpse of who someone is and what they want. And it's through nuances and the motivations of a large ensemble of characters that Dune crafts its conflict and drama. The drama that Herbert wrote into Dune is one of the best things he achieved in this book, because it is meticulously detailed and all of those details are super interesting. But that's also a big reason why Dune gained a reputation for being untranslatable to a film. There's just too much going on in this vast web of tangled politics and lore, and it would be impossible to explain all of it in such a short time. Actually, let me amend that. The problem is not that it's too much to explain in a short amount of time. You could read a Wikipedia page or watch a YouTube video explaining Dune's lore in a shorter amount of time than a feature film, and walk away knowing most of the necessary information. But you can't just spend 10 minutes dryly historicizing a centuries-long political rivalry and then expect the audience to give a shit when that rivalry reaches a climax. You want the audience to do more than simply give a shit. It's supposed to thrill them. It's supposed to get them jumping out of their seats. That's not going to be possible unless you know how to efficiently set up all of the right emotional beats. How to carefully position each little detail so that when you press play and it all unfolds, it does so in a way that provides dazzling payoffs for the audience. This isn't impossible by any means. Every once in a while there will be a short film or an advertisement or even an isolated scene from a TV show that is so well crafted that people will say, "That achieved in 5 minutes what blah 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 couldn't achieve in 5 seasons." It's like that overused Redditor joke where people will say, "Still a better love story than Twilight." But the thing they say it about is like an ad for car insurance or a picture of 2 raccoons holding hands. Usually it's said sarcastically, but there's still validity to the idea that you can make audiences feel profound feelings with a very short amount of time, even though it usually requires a lot of time to get people invested enough to feel anything. It's just really difficult to do. It's an art. In order to pull it off, you have to be smart with your time and smart with how you establish every tiny detail. So how does Villeneuve pull that off? Especially when adapting such ridiculously multifaceted source material like this epic allegorical space opera. It's not surprising that any space opera could start to feel convoluted. It's a genre which is ripe for that kind of thing to happen, because it's typically all about the intricate politics and power plays of lots of different figures, armies, and empires, who also usually have strange names, unfamiliar customs, and alien technologies. So if you're trying to write a sprawling, feudalistic political drama with lots of different actors all struggling for control, something like Game of Thrones, in my opinion, the following is the best way to handle that. It's good to have big entities that are at odds with each other because that provides a grand scale of the conflict. But the oh-so-delicious drama and intrigue comes from taking that and then providing further layers of complication to it, making it all more and more politically, socially, and morally messy. However, it still requires a delicate touch because when you have like 100 characters and they all want different things and the story goes on for too long, it's a classic problem that eventually your audience will simply get too confused and give up, or even the writers will lose track of certain important details because there's simply too many moving parts, too many balls up in the air all at the same time. I believe a good solution to that is to start with those big entities at play and then derive complications from that slowly, carefully, and subtly. If Dune was just a basic, stereotypical story, Herbert would have said it's the Atreides versus the Harkonnen and stopped there. The Harkonnen want power, the Atreides want justice, and that's that. But then you add the Fremen, who are subjugated under Harkonnen rule, who the Atreides hero wants to save, but actually ends up subjugating himself eventually. Then you add in the Bene Gesserit, who are playing both sides against each other, although, as Mother Moyam reminds us, there are no sides. Again, extremely on-the-nose dialogue, but it's true, and it's maybe helpful to remind everyone of that. But then you get to the part that feels kind of revelatory for me as an aspiring story writer now that I've noticed it. Once you have a few of those major entities established, you don't want to just keep adding more and more major entities. A better, more elegant approach is to take the entities you have and then make subtle tweaks to the motivations and paths of characters within those entities. It's not as simple as saying this is what the Bene Gesserit want, because what Jessica wants is slightly different than what Irulan wants, which is slightly different than what Mother Moyam wants. Fascinating conflict emerges in this way. Similarly, Stilgar and Chani are both Fremen, and their mutual primary motivation is to free the Fremen. But it's their disagreement about how to do this that makes that conflict a lot more compelling than it would have been if they were both on exactly the same page. Margot says another on-the-nose line, plans within plans, referring to the Baron orchestrating a publicity stunt to support Feyd's ascension into power, right in the middle of the Bene Gesserit's honeypot mission. But that's exactly what it is, and I'd argue that's the recipe that makes the drama and conflict in Dune work so effectively. It's all about plans within plans. The minor side characters are given just enough detail to each have a purpose of their own, yet that purpose all works together to make it a more interesting whole. I say work together, but I guess I really mean that the purposes of those characters all work against each other, and that's where the interesting conflicts come from. Sometimes you have situations where there's this massive ensemble cast, and it becomes a challenge to keep track of who everyone is. On top of that, it can make the narrative feel too messy and too crowded. I think a good summation of what to strive for when it comes to managing many different characters is this. The characters should make the narrative feel more complex, not more cluttered. You don't always need to have one main character, but in this case, I feel it works well that the side characters are still oriented towards the main character in some way. Gurney gets to kill Raban on his quest for justice. Chani allows herself to trust and opens her heart to someone and then gets her heart broken and then rides off into the sunset on her own. Jessica drinks worm piss and then becomes like the biblical Virgin Mary and then spends some quality time chatting with her psychic fetus. But relative to Paul, the conflicting voices of influence from the three of them emphasize that Paul is getting pulled in many different directions and he doesn't know who to listen to. Part of me thinks that at his core, Paul is possibly a sweet, sensitive guy who wants to do good and he wants to make everybody happy. He wants to make his dad proud of him, and so that makes Paul more susceptible to listening to Gurney, even though Gurney seems to be presenting a misguided view of Leto's aspirations. Paul wants to make his mom proud of him. He wants to be the man that Chani fell in love with. I'm sure Paul also wants to do what Paul wants to do, but as just a kid whose life path was laid out for him long before he was even born, I don't think Paul has had much chance to think about what Paul wants. It's tempting for me to say that Paul is just a toxic fuckboy who never loved Chani in the first place because of how he scorned her in the end. But, God, it kind of seems like the only thing Paul ever expressed sincere personal interest in, separate from some sense of duty or destiny, is Chani. Maybe all Paul actually ever wanted was just to find his girl and live a happy life with her. But then plans within plans had to come in and ruin everything. But speaking of my conflicting theories of what Paul's motivations are, that brings me to another example of overly direct dialogue I wanted to mention. Jessica and Paul are eating together and quietly chatting with each other. Paul says, "Look how your Bene Gesserit propaganda is taking root. Some of them already think I'm their messiah." And as he says this, we see a group of Fremen looking at Paul, approvingly, expectantly. Paul continues, "Others, false prophet." And the camera switches to a group of Fremen warily watching him. This information is pretty damn self-evident already just from the scene a few moments ago when Paul walks through the crowd for the first time. That scene was also far more effective at establishing that, for me at least, especially because I get overly stimulated by large crowds. My heart races and my palms sweat merely imagining what it would be like to walk through a swarm of strangers shouting angry things at me. Things like spy, witch, Jamis killer, or whatever. The anxious energy of how that scene is shot, switching between the hateful glares to Paul and Jessica's apprehensive expressions, punctuated by wider, high-angle shots showing how densely packed the mob is. The layered audio with all the people shouting on top of tense music and woeful, wailing laments, all building in intensity. Notice how Chani has been mostly sticking to Paul's side, but here she distances herself from him and disappears into the crowd of people, which likely makes Paul feel even more vulnerable and alone because now he's been ditched by the one person who has been even somewhat nice to him. And then finally we see someone desperately holding back the angry mob, shouting they don't know what they're saying, which almost feels like forgive them for they know not what they do. This whole scene feels biblical. And then the shift in tone as we see the Fremen worshipping Paul for the first time, and we also see the shock in Paul's face as he sees this for the first time, as well as Stilgar's realization that there are already some people who believe Paul to be the Lisan al-Gaib, just as Stilgar believes. Paul is going through some wild emotions right now for sure, since it's one thing to have a vague idea that there are prophecies you might have someplace in, but it's another thing entirely to see random strangers bowing and praying before you. This scene is very well done, and it was plenty to make us realize that there's not a unanimous consensus about Paul. We didn't need to have it spelled out for us so heavy-handedly, with Paul basically pointing at those that think he's a messiah versus those that think he's a false prophet. If this situation had been shot and edited just a little differently, it frankly could have been a comedic bit rather than a serious expositional moment. Picture if Paul had said exactly the same lines and exactly the same delivery, but the camera movement here had been more of a whip pan from the huddle of Paul's fans to the huddle of Paul's haters. And then a wide shot emphasizing the awkwardness of Paul and his mom just sitting right in between them, both huddles just a little too close to them. That would have gotten a chuckle out of me, but this isn't supposed to be a funny scene. And then what follows is legitimately the most confusing thing to me in the whole film. Paul does what might as well be a mustache-twirling villain monologue. He says with a disturbing amount of intensity and seriousness, "I must sway the non-believers. If they follow me, we can disrupt spice production. That's the only way I can get to the Emperor." Where the hell did that come from? Because of this one little line, it makes me totally question if we can believe anything that Paul says or does. Is it an act because he's really been a master manipulator all along? Maybe he knows exactly how to become an effective cult leader, and it's all about getting them to like you, accept you, and put their guard down first. I don't think that's outside the realm of possibility. He names himself after the little desert mouse, perhaps hoping that people will underestimate him. His answers often seem calculated and unnatural in how submissive and humble they are. For example, he asks Stilgar what he would do, and then Paul says, "Well, that's what I would do." He says he loves Chani's Desert Spring name, and then when she says she prefers Chani, he says, "Well, then so do I." Paul romances Chani by saying, "Well, then I would very much like to be equal to you." Paul saw firsthand that Leto's diplomatic style was to try to see eye to eye with the Fremen, to try to get on their level. He knows that the Fremen would be wary of any foreigner that comes in guns blazing, trying to big dick and out alpha everyone he meets. I truly don't fully understand Paul, and for every bit that I am willing to sympathize with him, see things from his perspective, and give him the benefit of the doubt, there's an equal part of me that can't help but wonder if the seeds of villainy were always within him. But of course, I think that if you're going to have an anti-hero character, this is the right way to do it. When there's a character who drifts over to the dark side and it's supposed to be this shocking, gut-wrenching fall from grace, that doesn't really work if the character seemed like a dastardly shithead the whole time. It also doesn't really work if we're asked to believe that someone just suddenly turned evil and that's just something that happens to people sometimes, randomly, even though everything they've ever done before that point was totally pure-hearted and virtuous. The fact that my interpretation of Paul prior to his Water of Life ritual could really go either way shows that this is a well-developed anti-hero. Another opinion I have about the dialogue in this film is that it made me realize that I'm perfectly fine with characters saying lines that explicitly tell us whatever we need to know about that character or situation, if that line is a banger. These lines can in fact be some of the most intensely memorable and powerful moments in a film, because it's viewed as being lazy or showing a lack of cleverness to tell and not show. We tend to see a higher level of artistry and how well a point or theme can be conveyed through subtext, smoke and mirrors, and metaphor. I usually agree. And one of the most common complaints I have about most fiction is that I feel there is little artistry in how the ideas and themes are articulated, but this movie did present a counterpoint to me in that view. It made me realize that there is also an art to writing a line which captures the quintessence of an idea or theme so perfectly, so succinctly, that it becomes emblematic of that theme or idea rather than merely evocative of it. And why wouldn't this be the case, or why does it come as any surprise to me? Especially as an aspiring writer of essays, I know that I often write way too much in long, convoluted sentences and walls of text trying to explain a certain thought I had, to get people to care about this thought and see it in the same way that I do in my head. But the problem is that eloquence is an art form. Even if I devoted 10 pages to making one single point, I can still fail to communicate it successfully, when simply one perfect line might have gotten my point across 1,000% more resonantly. The problem is that it's tremendously difficult to find the right words. When someone devotes themselves to the craft of writing, that's the whole thing that they're trying to get better at. Finding the right words. In fact, it's certainly possible that's the whole reason I'm writing and sharing this first think piece of mine. Because it's a way to deal with the horrible frustration of feeling like I know I have meaningful commentary to make about the art I love, But when I'm talking about it with people I know, it often just comes out as me saying, it's just, wow, it's so good. Oh my God, it's so cool. Wow. It's good, I have a lot of trouble articulating my thoughts the way I want to unless I write it out first. On that note, I encourage more of you out there to try writing and sharing your own discussions like this, because I think many, if not most people, do have meaningful things to say, but it's just difficult to say it. When I was on the debate team in high school, I remember my debate coach would give the same speech to the novices every year, saying, you might not realize it, but the biggest problem you have in your life right now, and will continue to have as a teenager and as an adult, is that you don't know how to communicate what you're thinking and feeling. Every single thing in your life will get easier and better the more you learn how to do that. I feel like there's truth to that, genuinely, for everyone. I will give the disclaimer that I think there's a dark side to this sentiment, and incidentally, that's the whole inspiration behind The Voice as Herbert imagined it. The idea that people can be controlled into doing and believing pretty much anything, with nothing but certain words communicated a certain way. And I can also easily imagine a cynical, misanthropic response saying that most people do not have meaningful things to say. That, in fact, the problem with our society is that everybody thinks they do, and they won't shut up about whatever insipid, self-important drivel comes to their mind. But I don't know. I honestly believe that as long as you try your very best to remain respectful, open-minded, humble, and compassionate, I genuinely do believe that the world would benefit if we all tried to spend more time sitting with any given subject and just thinking about it, exploring our ideas and interpretations, and figuring out how to more clearly externalize what's in our head. This whole video essay thing that I'm making right now is simply because I'm trying to practice what I preach, and now I know exactly how vulnerable and difficult it is, but it's still worthwhile. I feel that most people won't want to pursue doing something like that because they know it's unlikely that they'll become the next big YouTube video essayist or film critic or whatever. But that's not the point. The point is that I believe you most likely truly do have interesting, valuable things to say, and you owe it to yourself to figure out how to say those things. Anyways, I was trying to say that I think there are a lot of lines in Dune Part 2 that are admittedly extremely unsubtle, but I find them almost beautiful in their blatant overtness. I have lots of examples of lines that achieve this in Dune Part 2 for me personally. Mother Moyam says of the Bene Gesserit, "We don't hope, we plan." Only 5 words, and yet that so exquisitely sums up exactly the Bene Gesserit's philosophy and approach to things. And by understanding this, we immediately gain insight into their influence on the whole Dune universe. Chani tells Paul, "You'll never lose me if you stay who you are," which is such a lovely sentiment, and it breaks my heart because she's telling the absolute truth, but it's a warning as much as it is a promise. Compare that to Paul's, "I'll love you as long as I breathe," which proves to be just a sweet nothing. There are even plenty of sinister examples, because sometimes a line can be very well written, not because it's beautiful, or because you like anything about it, but rather because it's so effective at making you hate or fear the person who said it, because the words are so intensely menacing. As it is when Feyd is about to kill and maybe also torture Chani's friend, and he says, "Only pleasure remains." I know that a lot of people have said that they think the hardest lines in the movie were dropped during Paul's speech to the Fremen right after he drinks the water of life. Quite a few of the most memorable and iconic scenes from cinema involve a man's shouted monologue. Maybe this is because the way the actors say these lines is something you can easily do an impression of by just raising your voice. But these monologues also typically exist as a sort of climactic release to the culmination of tension and emotion that the film has been building up to that point. Think, "You can't handle the truth" from A Few Good Men, or "I've abandoned my son, I've abandoned my boy, and there will be blood." By the way, I haven't seen either of those movies, but that just makes it even better for demonstrating my point, because there are enough pop culture references to those lines that it's possible for me to talk about them without even seeing the films they come from. Paul's monologue was likely intentionally emulating one of those iconic man shouting passionately scenes, and certainly there's an overlap here with monologues that are meant to be a call to action, a rallying cry, a manifesto of revolution, a pep talk before going into battle. Paul's speech achieves that intention. People got fired up about it, and it's already become one of the most referenced parts of the film. It worked exactly as intended, and to me, the most interesting thing about this monologue is this more meta aspect of it, which is that it worked so well, and yet nobody is going to be able to quote this like they can with comparable speeches, because Timothée Chalamet is not speaking English. Obviously, this was done somewhat out of necessity because Paul is addressing the Fremen, so it wouldn't make any sense for him to be speaking English. Many Hollywood blockbusters would just ignore this, though, and figure that it's okay if a few people notice and are distracted by this brief lapse in believability, because after all, this is a big moment. It would be detrimental to this big moment to make the audience have to read subtitles. So I think this scene is an accomplishment by the filmmakers and Chalamet in that regard alone, because it's proving that you don't need to sacrifice believable world building for audience appeal. It becomes a more impressive testament to Chalamet's acting ability that he was able to give people chills by saying a bunch of made-up words. But finally, I think it's also possible that this was purposeful in order to make sure that people couldn't as easily emulate and therefore glorify this speech. It kind of backfired because I've still seen plenty of corny, ultra-badass fan edits of this scene on TikTok, but oh well. That was, of course, Herbert's greatest lament about the response to his novel, the fact that so many readers missed the point that Paul is not supposed to be this lionized heroic figure. Audiences have a tendency to latch onto characters they probably shouldn't admire and then dog whistle their affiliation with whatever that character supposedly represents by quoting them, or even slapping quotes that were never said by that character on top of pictures of them, like we see from all of those awful Joker motivational posts. I also haven't seen Braveheart, but with just a quick Google search of that speech, I can see that I am William Wallace is comparable to Paul's monologue, because most of what Paul says is an I am statement. Even the first thing he yells that gets everyone's attention and makes them stand up is I am pointing the way. But I'll admit, I started writing this point before I'd actually gone back and watched the scene again, because what I was remembering was mostly the I am statements, such as, of course, I am Paul Muad'Dib Atreides, the Duke of Arrakis, and yet, looking back on it, most of the monologue is actually Paul telling the Fremen declarative statements about them, who they are, what they're thinking. There's this dynamic interplay between Paul and the people around him which energizes this scene. And appropriately so. This is a scene about one individual finally taking on the long-foretold role of a messianic figure, a highly personal and exclusive metamorphosis from boy to man to God, but it's equally a scene about the cult of personality which surrounds him, because ironically it is only through his followers that this leader is able to become what he is. His power exists not within himself, but through them. But it is only by convincing them of the power within him that he can achieve their devotion. I can understand the criticism that Paul's metamorphosis felt rushed, but because there is relatively little to go off of, I find myself reading way deeper than necessary into every tiny subtlety of how this transformation is depicted, choosing to believe that there is probably more meaning than there actually is in each of these tiny subtleties. I know this is surely very much by accident on Villeneuve's part, but in writing this video, I've almost felt like I'm playing back the footage, and I keep shouting, pause, enhance, scribbling little theories on my notepad like I'm trying to solve a crime. Or more accurately, like I'm a criminal psychologist researching the early life of a serial killer, trying to sleuth out if there were ever any signs, trying to figure out how this monster was created and why. For example, right after Paul's ritual, he speaks with Jessica, and he says, "The visions are clear now. I see possible futures all at once. Our enemies are all around us, and in so many futures they prevail. But I do see a way. There is a narrow way through." As he says this, the camera is focused not on his face, but on his hand, as he turns his hand on its side to represent the narrow way. This is fascinating to me. On the one hand, pun, it's visually striking and a lot more fresh and inventive cinematically than to simply show his face as we'd expect. But it's also symbolic, and I believe symbolic in many ways. For one, the Lisan al-Gaib points the way, as we know. Paul isn't pointing here per se, but I think there's obviously some significance in using his actual hand to signify the actual way. The fact that the camera focuses on his hand this whole time reminds me of the idea that real-world cult leaders, zealots, serial killers, and dictators are often able to do their evil deeds and get away with it for far too long, all because they're so charismatic. Maybe I'm making this up, but I feel like there's a trait common among charismatic and manipulative people, which involves using lots of hand gestures and speaking animatedly, because it's sort of mesmerizing. It indicates a confidence which gets people to believe you're right, even if you're not. It's almost like sleight of hand. If you can just get them to focus on what you're doing with your hands, they're less likely to realize that what you're saying is insane. The motion Paul does suggests physical evidence of him being corrupted by power and control. It evokes villainy. It evokes godlike power. These gestures which imply Paul holding fate in his hand, holding lives in his hand, as well as his ability to manipulate fate. We know that Paul does go on to truly have this power to change the course of history. But this is the first indication we get that maybe having this much power feels sort of good to Paul. When fictional characters first obtain their superpowers, it's common to see them staring at their outstretched hands as if beholding, basking in, and enjoying this great new power. As with any real-world tyrant or fictional supervillain, it's true that there would be no quest for world domination without a psychotically overinflated ego. And just by twisting his hand a smidge, Paul seems to confirm that he's aware of his own ability to manipulate the fate of the universe. Whereas before he seemed reluctant to accept this about himself, here we see him gesturing in a way that signifies he seems to know he could simply alter the whole universe with nearly the same ease as a mere wave of his hand. There's a lot of egotism in that. Obviously. There's also egotism in his words here, because what he's describing is like a delusional gambler who knows that his odds are 1,000,000 to 1, but he still rolls the dice anyways because he's convinced he just can't lose. That's not only stupid and arrogant, but cruel when we remember that Paul is rolling the dice with the lives of billions of people. Do you realize how far up your own ass you would have to be to literally see exactly how slim your chances are? To know that you will end up causing a massive and bloody holy war, even if you technically succeed. And still, you're gonna be like, yeah, I can make it. I got this. Paul has gone full Antichrist. He's lost his goddamn mind and soul. We know how effective Paul is at converting the non-believers, and we see the persuasive tactics and charisma he uses to do this through his Duke of Arrakis monologue. He steals the show with that scene, and he's the focus, obviously. But an underrated aspect of this scene is how the camera will cut away, showing different characters' reactions to what he's saying. Even Gurney gets a moment here. And all it took was one quick glance at his face while he gets choked up as Paul shows everyone Leto's ducal signet. Even knowing how diabolical Paul becomes, there's still part of me which gets sad for Paul. And that sympathy is often triggered by sentimentality about his dead dad, I have to admit. I even got really sad for Paul during the part with the family nukes. There's a line that's like, this is the legacy of the Atreides. And it made me realize that this is all he has left of his father, and it's nuclear warheads of all things. Leto seemed like the best guy you can imagine. And I get it, nobody with that much power is probably actually a good person. But as far as how he's portrayed in part 1, I feel like the point is that he's never portrayed as saying or doing anything other than just the nicest, most down-to-earth, level-headed, cool dude thing to do in that situation. To be fair, I feel that the point here could also be that these perceptions can be deceptive, and often bad people can get as far as they do precisely because those around them are so blinded by that person's affability. Regardless, I think Villeneuve tends to make every scene reveal character in some way, and I feel all the scenes with Leto are meant to depict his tremendous likability. Think about the multiple times when his guards were about to go F someone up who got too close to Leto, and then Leto goes, no, let them speak. That's film language for, yeah, this guy's a ruler, but he's a good ruler. He's like a super chill ruler. Or think about that exchange with Paul when Leto says literally the most perfect thing he could possibly say. A good man doesn't seek to lead. He's called to it, and he answers. If your answer is no, you'll still be the only thing I ever needed you to be. My son. I know it's kind of cheating because that line was from part 1, but it still left such an impact on me that I felt the need to mention it. That was so incredibly sweet and moving. How could you not like the guy? That line is also important in how much it makes Jessica look like a bad parent compared to Leto. Jessica never says anything like this to Paul, and in fact, if you look at most of her interactions with Paul, she's always telling him things he must do. The first time we ever see them together, she demands that he practice using the voice. Then in this film, especially after she drinks the poison, this is amplified tenfold. She grips onto Paul's arm like a madwoman and pleads, "You must do what I did. You must drink the water of life. It will open your mind and you will see the beauty and the horror." In fairness to Jessica, consider the idea that Leto gets to be the fun parent, and he never has to be the bad guy or the enforcer, but maybe somebody has to. Maybe Jessica has to be sternly commanding with Paul because in a few cases, it actually probably is for his own good. If she hadn't forced Paul to learn how to use the voice, the two of them might have been killed by the Harkonnen back in part 1. I know we shouldn't pit parents against each other, and as a society, we tend to be much harder on moms than we are on dads. But Dune is in some sense a family drama, and Paul's fate is absolutely wrapped up in which of his parents' paths he follows. So I think it's worth mentioning that I do kind of feel like Paul would have been better off if Jessica had died instead of Leto. Leto's death is tragic not only because Paul loses his good and loving father, whom he loved very much, but also because you can tell how much Paul admires his dad and wants to be just like him. Had Leto lived, he might have been able to redirect his son during Paul's most misguided moments. Since during Dune 2, you can tell that Paul is attempting to honor his father through inheriting his legacy, trying to emulate his father. But it's Paul's ambition to do this which leads to his downfall because his pursuit of this ambition is so misguided. It's like Paul is saying, "I'm doing this for you, Dad." And if Leto was alive, he'd tell Paul, "I don't want this." I don't want to be unfair to Jessica, though. I find myself reading into Jessica's emotions in a way that's different than the way I read into the emotions of other characters. Because there's always an undercurrent of distrust. I closely watch her scenes through a lens of suspicion and scrutiny that isn't present when I watch other characters, because it's like I'm looking for reasons not to trust her. Like when I was rewatching part 1, I kept noticing myself trying to spot examples of foreshadowing and evidence to support the idea that she was bad from the beginning. I feel so conflicted about the fact that I'm literally evaluating her through a different lens than other characters, wondering if that's the same thing as literally holding her to a different standard than other characters. Like I'm worried that there's some element of internalized misogyny at play here. At the same time, though, it's like she did kind of help orchestrate a holy war. I don't think the fact that I'm critical of her on this means that I'm failing to be a woman who supports other women. I think it's trickier to show a character changing in a film as opposed to a novel. Obviously not impossible, since you could argue that an important feature of any good story is that the characters grow and experience a transformation of some kind. That's kind of the whole hero's journey. But the lack of interiority here in the film, as opposed to Herbert's novel, does make it more challenging to demonstrate the internal transformation of characters. Jessica is a great case study for illustrating that point, and whenever I read the book again, I'll be sure to evaluate how her character differs between the film and the book. But when we don't know her private internal thoughts, characters like Jessica are naturally examined differently than other characters for two main reasons. We might view her the way we view twist villains, where once we know they're a villain, we have to start asking if their actions in the film made sense prior to this reveal. The other reason is that she's got psychic and future-telling powers, as well as a close knowledge of prophecies and other esoteric wisdom. Whenever a character has this, it immediately opens up a big can of worms, which makes it complicated for them to say or do anything without potential plot holes and things like that getting unleashed. It's embarrassing the amount of times in my notes that I wrote down something Jessica said and then wrote, "Why doesn't she know that?" Or, "What is she trying to pull here?" One scene from part 1 that I remember specifically evaluating in this way was when she's outside the door listening to Paul undergo the Gom Jabbar box of pain ordeal. Since we know that Paul is obviously going to survive this, it becomes necessary to remind ourselves that Jessica doesn't know that for certain in this scene. How could she have explained that to Leto if Paul did fail the test, and then she has to sheepishly, shamefully walk up to Leto and explain, Yeah, so I might have accidentally gotten our son killed. To say one other thing in Jessica's defense, I want to briefly discuss when Anya Taylor-Joy Aaliyah tells Paul, "You will discover the truth about our family, and it will hurt you to the core." When Paul learns that truth about their family, he finds out that Jessica didn't know either. I become more sympathetic to Jessica because of this, because I know it probably hurt her to her core even more than it hurt Paul. Paul learns that Baron Harkonnen is his grandpa, which sucks for him, but Jessica finds out that's her father. This leads me to think that the character change Jessica experiences after the Water of Life ritual is multi-layered. Obviously, the sheer amount of the beauty and the horror she absorbs does a number on her psyche, as it would for anyone. It would be enough to say that's plenty to make a person lose their mind and call it a day. But I also wonder if it makes Jessica in particular question her identity and her place in the world in a way she never has before, in a way that causes her to act erratically because she is herself lost and confused. She might be having a little bit of an existential crisis as a result of learning that most of what she knew about herself and the world is wrong. At the very least, undergoing this ritual would result in a profound broadening of your perspective, which would likely force you to accept that you are not as important as you thought, and you don't have as much agency as you thought. Jessica is a sister of the Bene Gesserit, and she often speaks of the path, the way, all these things that imply that she believes in a larger plan and wants to play her part in it. However, keep in mind that Jessica disobeys the Bene Gesserit and seemingly tries to plant her own flag and take matters into her own hands by venturing to give birth to the Kwisatz Haderach herself. To me, that says, I know better than you do. I can do this on my own, and I'm also the right person to do this. It's also a way of cementing a place in history for herself because it allows her to become a Mother Mary type figure. To me, this implies that Jessica believes in her own importance and her ability to shape history. Whether you want to call that ambition or hubris is up to you. So to then partake in the Water of Life ritual and learn that she's the daughter of the Baron would radically shake her whole worldview and lead to a real identity crisis for her. All of a sudden, she's forced to accept that she is also merely a pawn in this game. She wanted to believe that she could be the one to call the shots and make things happen, but she's forced to accept that she was naive, that there was so much she didn't know, even about herself. In response to this, Jessica goes all out with taking on this Reverend Mother role. And I believe that's partially because she's clinging to her own ego, thus making it even more important for her to solidify her legacy, but also partially because she legitimately sees that the path is much bigger than her. Comparing it to a religious experience, I feel this interpretation matches quite well. There's that oceanic feeling which causes you to realize that there's something much bigger than you. That's what makes people become highly devout, a true reverence for and desire to be part of and in service of that thing which is so much bigger than them. But the human ego often fights like a trapped animal against this surrender to a higher being. And I think that's why there's a long history of religious leaders who are egomaniacs and zealots. Because for some people, it's difficult to authentically let go of the idea that they know better than God, that they are infinitely smaller and less important than God. Certainly Paul's response to learning about their blighted family tree is not the way to go. He says, we're Harkonnen, so this is how we'll survive, by being Harkonnens. You'd expect him to at least try to avoid becoming the evil he once sought to destroy, but apparently he's pretty self-aware about that happening, and he's just going with it for some reason. With this in mind, I've started to view the Harkonnen not so much as your typical villains, but more as a symbol of evil, which includes Paul's temptation towards taking that path, turning towards the dark side, so to speak. I arrived at this conclusion because if I had to pick any part of Dune that I don't totally adore, it would have to be the Harkonnen. It's not even that I think this aspect of the story is bad, it's just that I think everything else is so genius that it sort of feels uninspiring to me by comparison. Honestly, it had me really racking my brain to figure it out, to see what I was missing here, because I think so highly of both Herbert and Villeneuve and their mastery of storytelling that it felt incorrect to me that the story would include such one-dimensional, stereotypical antagonists. Especially since a lot of Herbert's intention was to critique dogmatic views of conflict and power, it seems like an obvious layer of that would be to critique the dehumanization of the other side, seen so commonly in militaristic propaganda. That's often a way that people were and are motivated into risking life and limb because they've been adequately convinced that whatever entity they're fighting against are not people, but instead evil, greedy, bloodthirsty monsters. And yet, here in this otherwise astute sociopolitical allegory, the other side actually are not really people, but instead evil, greedy, bloodthirsty monsters. That's all the Harkonnen are. That's their whole thing, and there is no other thing. There's never this moment of humanity that allows us to glimpse into some deeper part of them. But for shit's sake, you never see them doing anything that isn't totally depraved. We briefly see both Feyd and the Baron in a more relaxed, recreational setting. Settings where they're just kind of hanging out, doing their own thing. This is in contrast to scenes in military settings where the narrative purpose is explicitly to establish how threatening these guys are. Like when Raban smashes the bejesus out of that Enderlin's head. This scene gets right to the point, establishing that these are the Fremen's enemies, and by Dave Bautista calling them rats and being so aggressively fixated on hunting them down and exterminating them like it's the most important thing in the world to him, there is zero ambiguity about the Harkonnens' motive and the threat they pose to the Fremen. The threat imposed by this enemy is even more clearly established by smashing that poor guy's head in, especially because of the visceral brutality of it. Because, my god, the sound that dude's head makes, ugh. But when we see the Baron chilling in his bathtub, it's not necessary for him to be bathing in vile black sludge, yet he is. When we're first introduced to Feyd, he's also just enjoying his own idle time. There's no technical reason why he couldn't be just sleeping or eating a meal or doing something normal for a young man. The astute listener might notice that I used those examples specifically because when we first meet Paul in Dune Part 1, he's waking up from a dream and then having a quiet breakfast with his mother. Instead, Feyd is found presumably post-orgy with his harem of girls who all look like Yolandi Visser, and then he's presented a blade by a freaky little guy with his tits out. Feyd then licks the blade for some reason, then violently murders two of those girls for no other reason than just because he can. On that note, I should mention that this scene and the aforementioned Dave Bautista head-smashing scene serve an additional purpose in that they establish the hierarchy of Harkonnen society. The fact that members of the royal family like Feyd and Raban, can get away with killing anyone they please for no reason, and they will never be questioned or challenged for doing so. And doubtlessly anyone who does question or challenge them about this will have the same thing happen to them. Even their baldness makes them seem more evil. Let me clarify. This comes from my little theory that the more you show or imply a character doing things that seem normal to the average audience member, the less evil that character seems, because it's something that the audience can relate to doing as part of their average everyday life. Usually it doesn't matter because it would be splitting hairs, excuse the pun, for someone to get hung up on something trivial like this that only happens off-screen anyways. But if you portray a villain with perfectly coiffed hair, you do sort of unintentionally invite the possibility that someone might realize that said villain probably has to spend an hour every morning making sure that their hair sits just so. To a lot of people, that thought doesn't even cross their minds, and ultimately, I suppose it truly doesn't matter, but I occasionally do get hung up on these things. To give an example, for those of you who have watched Better Call Saul, there are those twin henchmen guys, and they're supposed to be really badass and scary. But I just find it so cute thinking of them coordinating their little outfits together, like, what are we gonna wear today, bestie? It's kind of like that old cliche about how if you're nervous about speaking in front of people, you should try to imagine them in their underwear. It's these private, intimate moments that we all have in our daily lives where we seem the most vulnerable and the most human. The times when we truly reveal ourselves to be but mere mortals are the times when our tummy hurts. The times when we rehearse what we're going to say before making a phone call. The times where we try wearing a hat, but then we take it off halfway through the day. Because we feel like everyone can tell we're normally not a hat person. I think it was a good choice to make them hairless, because that just takes even more potential relatability out of them. Well, I guess provided that you're not someone who is also literally hairless from head to toe. It's not like it ruins a character if there's some aspect of their depiction which has some slightly unfitting external implication, since most people don't think about that stuff anyways. But I appreciate when I can tell that the crew were thinking about these little details. I'm not sure that this actually was an intentional choice made by the makeup team for this reason, and whatever tiny amount of sense this point makes is ruined if we presume that the Harkonnen are not canonically born hairless, but instead routinely spend time shaving themselves. But still, whatever. Oh well. And finally, it occurred to me that most likely the fact that the Harkonnen are so excessively evil in every facet of their characterization is the point. Hyperbole is this funny thing where it can be a pretty clear bad sign that someone is not a very good storyteller, because they're relying on it to force a certain understanding on their audience. But typically when a good storyteller uses such obvious hyperbole, as is the case with the Harkonnen, it's likely on purpose to make a certain point. So here's my list of possible reasons why the Harkonnen are so hyperbolically depicted as just like the epitome of pure evil. Number 1, because it's cool, aesthetically speaking. This one is an obligatory mention because obviously I do think there's a deeper meaning behind how the Harkonnen are portrayed. But I'm getting this out of the way first because it should probably be mentioned that there are simply certain stylistic benefits to making the Harkonnen so goddamn edgy. I do think it's kind of funny that they're so villainous that their sun makes everything black and white, and even their fireworks have to be vaguely unnerving and spooky, but you can't deny that it looks cool. Number 2. Maybe it's to encourage us to question our assumptions about what evil means. When I invited my parents to watch Dune with me, there was some hesitation about whether I should do that or not, since they hadn't seen the first one. But then I remembered it would be fine because Dune Part 2 is actually pretty damn deliberate and overt about the major story beats, to the point where anyone will be able to at least get the gist. When I had that thought, the main thing that came to mind was that I definitely wasn't going to need to lean over to my parents in the theater and whisper to them, "These are the bad guys," when the Harkonnen came on screen. Because if I did, I'd expect my dad to probably laugh at me and say something like, "Yeah, no shit, those are the bad guys." By having an entity in the film which is so stereotypically villainous, maybe that makes it more impactful when we eventually realize that the handsome, strong-jawed, blue-eyed dude who we expect to be our Luke Skywalker, our Frodo Baggins, or Harry Potter is the one who will one day be responsible for the death of 61 billion people. Number 3. Maybe it's necessary for Paul's story that he's confronted with such an imposing force because that's what motivates the vengeful ambition which eventually corrupts him. Actually, this one isn't even really a maybe. I think this is probably the actual reason why the Harkonnen are so heinous. If the Harkonnen weren't such a huge, scary threat, it would make the extreme measures Paul takes to fight them a lot less justifiable. But their narrative purpose is not so much for Paul to defeat them, but instead to help demonstrate the ways in which he gradually becomes more and more like them. This is why when the Baron is finally killed, he dies like a bitch. Technically, Paul says, "You die like an animal," but we know what he really meant. You would think that it'd be a bigger deal when the big bad is ultimately defeated, but in this movie, it's not at all. That's because it's not the main conflict of this movie. On the surface, it might seem like this is a basic revenge narrative where the hero needs to kill the dude who killed someone he loves, but that's not what Dune Part 2 is truly about. In fact, I'd say the Baron's death is so distinctly anticlimactic, specifically to make this point. The Baron weakly lays there, Paul walks in and stabs him like it's nothing, and the Baron's body gets dumped out in the desert for ants to crawl around on. The Baron was never the major threat in this story. Paul is the major threat. That's why even the duel with the big bad's scary nephew is treated more as the climactic final showdown of the film. Because narratively speaking, Feyd acts as a foil to Paul. It works on a literal, non-symbolic level, of course, because Feyd is a menace and he needed to be killed. But you could also make the argument that this is somewhat symbolic of Paul facing off against his own dark side. Number 4. My last theory is probably the most abstract and the largest stretch, but it occurred to me that maybe the reason that the Harkonnen are evil to the point of no longer seeming humanoid is because they're not supposed to represent any actual human being or group of people, but instead they're symbolic of something else. As far as what they're symbolic of, well, the answer I came up with is maybe just general badness. Oh god, that sounded so stupid. But just hear me out for a second. As someone who chooses to believe that people are inherently good, or at the very least all have the capacity for good, or at the very least are not inherently bad, it seems natural to assume that people would be much kinder to one another and there would be much less violence and depravity, if not for the fact that life itself is flawed. Frank Herbert said himself that one of the major themes of the book is that man inflicts himself upon his environment. So I can see how it would seem like I'm egregiously missing the point. If I made this backwards-ass argument sounding like I'm saying that it's actually man's environment that turns man bad. I'm not. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that I think there's often at least some sort of external impetus which provides the context for conflict. These are things like scarcity, like famine and disease, like natural disasters, like natural predators, even just accidents. Like, imagine how someone could be a good person, but then their child dies in some random freak accident, and then it's understandable how that could change a person drastically for the worse. Do you see what I mean now by just general badness? That exists in the world and is an important factor in many, if not most, major conflicts, even before you get into the more human conscious elements like greed, hatred, and sadism. It doesn't excuse the bad things that people do in reaction to those things that have happened to them, or that exist within the situational experience they share with other people. It's possible to empathize with and understand the bad things that contribute to who a person becomes, but it's still the moral responsibility of each person alive to rise up and be as good as they can possibly be, despite whatever circumstances life has given them. Sometimes people will talk about some person who's done awful things, and they'll be like, oh, well, they had such and such awful thing that happened to them. And I just think it's important to remember that you can feel sad for that person's sadness on a human-to-human level without letting that become a justification for whatever unjustifiable actions that person does. The Harkonnen might be so hyperbolically bad because they're meant to serve as a personification of the bad things that provide an impetus and context for violent conflict and moral corruption to emerge. To provide an analogy, let's say that there's this village that had their crops ravaged by a plague of insects. And now their people are going to die without those crops, so they go ransack a nearby village. But now the descendants of the people from that ransacked village still hate the people who stole from their ancestors. So now a century later, these two villages are still killing and hating each other, even though the original inciting incident has long since passed. In this analogy, I think you could argue that the Harkonnen are like one of the villages, but I think the argument could potentially be made that the Harkonnen are also just the plague of insects. Because there's so much content to try to adapt in a much shorter span of time, Villeneuve and John Spates had to master what my poetry professor called economy of language. The idea is that every word matters in a poem, so each word must be used for a highly purposeful reason. And ideally, it should be able to serve multiple purposes at the same time, which is why poetry is typically associated with metaphor and ambiguity of interpretation, even more so than prose. Similarly, one way a film director can achieve that economy is through compression. As if all the content is a cloud of atoms and you're squeezing it together to get the densest possible marble of pure matter with no empty space in between. But another way to do this is through multitasking. Even if you've compressed a concept as tightly and densely as you possibly can, you can still make it even more efficient by designing it to achieve multiple purposes simultaneously. For this purpose, hyperbole as well as tropes and cliches are not necessarily a bad thing, because they serve exceptionally well as a form of shorthand, and therefore you can communicate something to your audience much more efficiently because they already have in their minds all the context and meaning imbued within this trope. Let's look at an example. I would say it's a bit tropish when Feyd taunts Paul about Chani during their duel, saying, "Is this your pet? Any special instructions for the pet?" That's pretty standard fight scene smack talk from a villain. We often see the antagonist threatening that after they kill the hero, they're going to do bad things to the one the hero loves most. This already achieves a couple purposes, and that's probably why it became a trope in the first place, because it's effective. It gives yet more reason to boo and hiss at the villain, because it's so depraved to essentially say, after I kill you, I'm going to rape and torture the woman you loved. It's helpful to throw in a little reminder of just how evil he is, right at the height of the conflict. It also reminds us of the stakes, or even furthers the stakes if we hadn't considered that implication yet. That if the hero dies, his beloved will likely be raped and/or tortured and/or killed. It preys upon the hero's greatest fears, since archetypically his mission is to save the princess. But it takes that mission and provides a sense of consequence, which makes it a lot darker and heavier. I mean, can you imagine if Bowser said shit like this to Mario? But on a more intimate psychological level, it is often the case that the hero's deepest, darkest fear is this very idea, that he cannot protect the ones he loves most. I feel like the best examples of a well-told hero's journey emphasize this aspect. In my view, there are few other motivations and fears a hero might have which are more compelling or true to the concept of a hero than the idea that no amount of strength or power or triumph over evil can grant you certainty that those you love will always be safe. This is a sentiment that Dune evokes with Paul towards Chani, but you could also say that it's a concept which is brought up within Jessica's motivations, since she often claims that whatever she's doing is done to protect Paul. I honestly want to go back and count up each time she mentions protecting Paul or keeping him safe, and examine the context of each of those instances, since I suspect that in most cases, the context is not something that would actually keep Paul safe. In some cases, it's probably the opposite, and often used merely as a justification to do something. This idea of keeping someone or something safe is actually especially prominent in this story, because what that is, at its core, is uncertainty about the future. We see something pretty similar to this with Anakin and Padme in the Star Wars prequels, just handled a lot more clumsily. Anakin is driven to the dark side because of his visions of Padme dying, but then it's Anakin turning over to the dark side, which eventually causes Padme's death. Paul is frightened by his vision of Chani with her face burned, and notice that he gets that vision right as he chooses to launch nuclear warheads with face-melting destructive power. If you saw one brief, confusing vision of your beloved being harmed, it's natural that you would be desperate to know more in order to try to stop it. It's just cruel irony that in this case, the one thing she begged him not to do was to drink the poison that would give him that knowledge. But going back to the trope with Feyd threatening Chani, Dune 2 utilizes this cliché well because of all the purposes which made it effective enough to become a trope in the first place. But the important thing that Villeneuve and Spades achieve in their script is not only knowing exactly when to employ a trope and why, but also elevating the tropes they use by recontextualizing them, and through that recontextualization, achieving additional layers of meaning. When Feyd taunts Paul, it makes Irulan aware of the fact that Paul is in love with another woman, which makes Irulan feel guilty because she had no intention of stealing someone's man. Not only does she feel pity for Chani, but it also sucks for Irulan personally, because it definitely sets her marriage off on the wrong foot. Even in a political marriage, it's possible that she and Paul could have truly liked and even loved one another. But now Irulan knows that his heart belongs to somebody else. And she also knows that now she has to be married to a guy who seems like a bit of an asshole. Since, who does that? Who proposes to another woman right in front of their girlfriend, while simultaneously threatening the life of your father, I might add? It also gives Paul the hint that Feyd is looking closely at Paul's eyes during the fight. Feyd wouldn't have been able to pick Chani out of the crowd and figure out that they're romantically involved, unless he was closely monitoring how Paul looked at Chani. My theory is that Paul observed this and used what he knew about Feyd, despite only just meeting him moments ago, to figure out the plan that leads to Paul's victory in the duel. Paul recognizes that Feyd is a sadist who's obsessed with pain. So Paul grips onto the knife, and while Feyd is distracted by watching Paul suffer, Paul is able to sneak in the killing blow. To some extent, I'm slightly surprised I've become such an adoring fan of Dune, because it does certain things that I typically don't like. For instance, there are a handful of cliché tropes used in this that I tend to roll my eyes at whenever I see it in other media. But for varying reasons, I always end up giving it a pass here in Dune. In fact, I usually find myself even more fascinated because it gets me thinking about all these meta aspects of these tropes, which is a topic I have a particularly strong interest in and tend to bring into my examination of any piece of media. I should also note that these are often things from the novel, and it's true that in 1965 these tropes might have felt less cliché, and in some cases might have had less of a socially complicated connotation. In fact, the reason why certain tropes from Dune may feel tired now is specifically because Dune had such a profound influence on the fiction which came after it. This is something which is always important to keep in mind when revisiting the classics. Sometimes these classics can feel dated, generic, or uninspiring, but that's because they were so influential in their time that everything else after it has copied from it. I watched John Carpenter's Halloween, for instance, and I found myself bored by it because it felt like the most generic slasher possible. But I had to remind myself that this is the case because Halloween served as the prototype, and you can see evidence of its legacy all over within contemporary slasher films. Dune is a fascinating case study in this regard for so many reasons. Villeneuve had to tackle the issue of figuring out how to adapt a wildly influential novel from the 1960s to an IMAX screen in the year of our Lord 2024. And he had to figure out how to ensure that nothing would feel dated or tired, even while knowing that many of these things only feel dated or tired in the first place because the 1965 novel did it first and made that thing popular. Another aspect of this challenge is that despite the fact that George Lucas was clearly inspired by Dune in making Star Wars, it's Star Wars which became the far larger pop culture phenomenon. So now that makes it impossible to make a big budget blockbuster out of Dune without a ton of people evaluating it within the context of their mental model of a Star Wars movie. And it's kind of crazy because you also get people who expect the movie to be generic because they feel like they already know this type of story. And you get people complaining about how these oversaturated chosen one and white savior narratives need to just go ahead and die already, not realizing that even in the original novel from the 60s, this story was supposed to be a subversion of those narratives. There's so much going on here just on the cultural level alone. How the culture has changed from the release of the novel to now, which adds to the difficulty in adapting what was already considered an unfilmable book, even separately from this area of complication. I can see how somebody might listen to this and be like, she keeps mentioning that Dune Part 2 is full of tropes, but this movie wasn't even that tropey, so what's she talking about? And to be honest, this might be more the case with Dune Part 1 than with Part 2. Because the examples that are coming to mind for me the most right now are things from Part 1. If you're curious enough about this topic to want an itemized list of tropes from the film, I read quite a few legitimately good pieces of insight on the TV Tropes page for Dune Parts 1 and 2. One example is that I hate it when we first see the main characters, they're waking up. I think this is like the laziest type of character introduction, and it feels very much like a student film whenever the first thing we see the protagonists do is hit their alarm clock. But as I mentioned when I was contrasting Paul's introduction to Feyd's introduction, I think it's for the best that Paul is presented in such a mundane, boring, but relatable way. Villeneuve could have easily introduced us to Paul in a way more befitting of the Duke of Arrakis. Paul could have been right in the middle of some thrilling action that shows how brave and cunning he is. Paul's scenes in most of Part 1 and still some of the earlier scenes in Part 2 are meant to emphasize his relatability, to emphasize the ways that he's still just some regular kid as opposed to asking us to marvel at his grandeur. That's on purpose, of course, but it's not exactly like subversive or anything. There was a time when everyone's favorite stereotypical male comic book heroes were guys like Superman or Conan the Barbarian. It felt cool because it was so far removed from what anyone could possibly be or achieve. But nowadays, I feel like way more people prefer Spider-Man to Superman, and that's likely because they can see more of themselves in Spider-Man. He seems more like the type of dude they'd want to be friends with. I should point out, I'm making too broad of a generalization here, since I know it's still very popular to have an action hero who is admired specifically for the ways that he exceeds the limits of what a regular guy can do. John Wick is the example that comes to mind right now, but there are still tons of other examples of characters who people love because of how impossibly badass they are. Even with Paul, I'm sure we've all seen those clips where people compare the beta, mild-mannered Paul of Part 1 to the alpha Muad'Dib of Part 2. In that fan cam editing style one uses to display great reference. But that leads me to the reason why I think there is an extra layer of cleverness in Villeneuve's decision to play up the relatability factor of Paul right from the start. It's not just because that's a crowd-pleasing way to depict a hero. It's not just because it provides contrast between Paul and Feyd. It's not just to make his character progression more starkly apparent. The most hard-hitting and emotionally effective reason of all is that it gets you to like, root for, and even identify with a person who eventually does very, very bad things. Alright, so another trope I dislike is when the dream girl is literally a figure that appears in the male protagonist's dream before he ever meets her. Like this is Scott Pilgrim or something. I know that this is from the book, but it's like, are we really surprised that Chani from the books lacks much agency or personality of her own when she's introduced in this way that almost suggests Paul dreamed her into existence, or otherwise that she was created to be the subject of Paul's dreams? This might not be true, but I have a suspicion that Villeneuve was planning to stick a little bit closer to the Chani of the novel when part 1 was being made, and then he realized it would be more interesting to take her character in a different direction. In part 1, we briefly see a vision where Chani and Paul are seemingly leading the Fremen side by side. And most of the time we see Chani, it's through those visions that look like a perfume ad. So I think it's plausible that maybe Villeneuve realized she was being used as a device to move Paul's plot along, rather than her own person, and he wanted to amend that. Again, I don't know if that's the case, but if it is, I say good for him, honestly. On this topic of tropes and cliches, it's totally possible for even good storytellers to accidentally stray too far into a stock character or a one-dimensional depiction of something. But that doesn't mean they aren't allowed to then recognize that and try to do something different next time. Similarly, even if Villeneuve knew the whole time that he wanted to take Chani in this direction, he still obviously made a conscious choice to alter the original character from the novel. I think if someone is adapting a story, they should be allowed to do this. The problem is that changing any character in any way is a notoriously contentious thing to do. People on the internet are frothing at the mouth to complain about such changes whenever it happens, but at the same time there will still be some other people who complain when you keep a character or part of the story the same. Whether that's because the way it was written originally is bad and the adaptation sheds new light on that, or whether because it's a vestige of story writing that probably shouldn't be kept around nowadays. It could even be the valid complaint that people are getting bored of the same exact characters doing the same exact things. And if we insist on keeping the same IPs perpetually revived over and over, then there's at least certainly a need for fresh, transformative takes on these things. Otherwise, what's the point besides nostalgia baiting? Like I've said, adaptation is a delicate art and science, and a big part of that is the fact that you're never going to make everyone happy. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't make changes. And people are weirdly vocal and personally invested in these things. I think the biggest problem is that often things are altered not because that alteration truly strengthens the narrative, or because it breathes new life into a character, but instead because it's an effort to appease some presumed and often inaccurate notion of what audiences want. It feels tacky and hollow because it is. This is where it becomes the most obvious that if anyone should be trusted with adaptations of beloved IPs, it needs to be someone who truly gets that IP, as I've mentioned Villeneuve does with Dune. And I'd argue Blade Runner as well. And even then, keep in mind that truly getting it is some lightning in a bottle kind of thing. It's not necessarily that the creative leadership of adaptations like this should simply go to whoever is literally the world's biggest fan of a certain story. Getting a story, and also possessing the storytelling mastery required to achieve a good adaptation, is completely different than simply deeply loving or being deeply interested in that story. For example, I used to often imagine, and even sometimes write my own fan fiction when I was a kid, and often I would get really inspired by noticing an aspect of a character which I felt was underutilized or not explored thoroughly. Just because it's interesting to me personally to try to focus on Nightcrawler's inner turmoil and shame due to his demonic appearance, that doesn't mean it wouldn't ruin that character for all the people who love Nightcrawler because he's a happy-go-lucky goofball who rarely ever lets that kind of thing get him down. Often just having love or interest for something doesn't mean you're the right person to take the helm of it, and sometimes it can even get in the way if you're unable to focus on the things that truly matter the most, and you don't know how to kill your darlings when necessary. Just look at Jodorowsky's Dune, and you can see how it can become a problem when you want way too much out of something that needs to remain streamlined and limited. It's crucial to decide what to stay true to and what to alter within a narrative, based not on what you personally want to see, not what you think everybody else wants to see, but instead on what authentically strengthens the art. Looking at a character like Chani as an example, the solution shouldn't be to take the first one-dimensional character and replace her with a different one-dimensional character, except this time the one dimension is that she's a badass. I feel like Villeneuve made Chani so much stronger and more interesting and completely avoided that issue. Flat, stereotypical characters greatly hinder the story, no matter if that's because they're too weak or because they're too strong. If there's any take about this film which I genuinely believe is wrong and stupid as opposed to merely a difference in taste. It would have to be anyone complaining that they ruined Chani by giving her more agency and more of a voice. That change authentically made the story so much better. It made the romance far more nuanced and ultimately far more tragic. It provided a counterpoint to Paul's worldview, which allowed the audience to see the moral conflicts in greater clarity and detail. It offers a heroic guiding light in a story that is otherwise admittedly a little depressing, because apparently everybody just sucks, even the supposed good guy. I still think the Chani dreams are a bit goofy though, and I find it slightly laughable whenever I think too hard about any of the implications arising from the dreams about Chani. Like, I get that any particularly lifelike or powerful dreams that Paul has will be given special consideration and import by Lady Jessica and the Bene Gesserit, because they are closely monitoring Paul's developing impression, but I still find it funny that the matriarch was summoned to inquire into the dreams Paul is having, and then he has to explain to her that mostly the dreams are about Zendaya. Like, yeah, he's a horny teenage boy. The fact that he's having dreams about a pretty girl is totally normal. I half expected the matriarch to turn to Jessica and say, "Really? You dragged me all the way out here so that your teenage son could tell me he wishes he had a girlfriend? Since Feyd mentions to Margot, 'I dreamed about you last night,' it also makes me curious if inserting themselves and others in someone's dream is something the Bene Gesserit can do, and if they utilize that to puppeteer men by presenting a beautiful, ethereal woman like a carrot on a stick to guide the man around with. If they did this with Feyd and Margot in order to pique Feyd's curiosity about her, it seems plausible that the Chani dreams may have worked similarly. I'm honestly a little unclear on how the Bene Gesserit view Chani. We know that Chani is part of the Prophecies, but we also see quite a bit of tension between Chani and Jessica, for obvious reasons. Both of them are kind of pulling Paul in different directions. This isn't even so much a trope about your girlfriend and your mom bickering with each other, or a stereotypically difficult mother-in-law, as much as it is some vaguely Freudian critique which sees Paul caught between the path his mother wants for him and the path his lover wants for him. As I said, tropes and cliches are not necessarily a bad thing because they serve exceptionally well as a form of shorthand, and therefore you can communicate something to your audience much more efficiently because they already have in their minds all of the context and meaning embedded within that trope. I truly believe that, and I have a lot to say about that concept, but that's a much bigger discussion for another time. Just as a sign for a four-way intersection communicates and represents something that would take a whole page of a driver's ed manual to explain in words, just as having a Triforce on your t-shirt communicates to fellow fans that you like Legend of Zelda and might prompt them to come up to you and begin a friendship, tropes and genre conventions are fascinating to me in the way that they can be used as the building blocks in a larger structure. They are the symbols within a larger semiotic network. They are the words within cinematic language. And the way that Dune uses these building blocks, these symbols, these words, is something that I find really creatively inspiring. For example, Dune mixes and matches the cinematic language of many different genres, like how genre conventions from horror, such as the creepy voices and violin screeches, are used to evoke something like a demonic possession in order to emphasize how far gone Jessica is, whereas the romance of Paul and Chani is built up through tried and true conventions of romance fiction, like the "stop looking at me like that," dancing together as Chani teaches Paul to sandwalk, and so on. Another way Dune utilizes these tropes for their symbolic value is by making them function even more like a heuristic than they ever have before, by condensing them down to their densest and most succinct representation. Sometimes it feels like Villeneuve is playing a little game to see if he can capture the essence of a trope as succinctly as possible, to the point where that moment itself could become a representational sign, a minimalist symbol which is representative of the trope. This was something that occurred to me when Paul is rushing up to save Chani, and she turns around and blasts the shit out of that Harkonnen guy. There are plenty of examples like this all across fiction, where the hero thinks he needs to go save the damsel in distress, but then she proves she's perfectly capable of defending herself. But because the way Chani blasts that soldier is so excessive, because the force of it is so concussive, it becomes hyperbolic to the point that I could easily see a short 3-second gif of that moment being used as a model to communicate the essence of that trope to anyone who sees it. Utilizing tropes in these ways is exceptionally useful for the purpose of communicating things to your audience without a lengthy exposition dump. There's a lot to communicate to the audience, and not a lot of time for exposition dumping. So this kind of thing appears all over in Dune. And the writing is actually better off for it, in my opinion. Some people may not like it, but I think it's quite helpful. One view is that this is talking down to the audience and dumbing things down by spewing obvious signals and stereotypes at us. But I feel you could also argue the opposite. that you're really talking down to the audience when you do the thing that the Lynch version suffered from and allow narration and description to run rampant. Dune Part 2 mostly trusts its audience to be smart enough to figure out what something means based simply on context clues, and their pre-existing knowledge of cinematic language. In the same way that I kept getting the urge to lean over and whisper summaries to my parents in the theater, but then I kept remembering that they're definitely smart enough to figure it out on their own. Using tropes and cliches as shorthand for your audience works best when you can find some way to subvert, critique, defy, or comment on, expand on, and elevate that trope. In the case of Dune, the clearest example is the way it subverts the Chosen One narrative, and in that sense, this whole story is based on the premise of taking a trope and elevating it. For some reason, an example of this idea that always comes so strongly to my mind now is the first episode of Invincible. Skip ahead to... if you don't want the first episode of Invincible spoiled for you. My brother was raving about that show, so I checked it out, and for most of the first episode, I was pretty bored with it. Mostly because I believed it felt very generic, especially with the heroes. It just seemed so uncreative and lazy to have the chance to make a team of superheroes, and then you're just like, yeah, fuck it, this one will just be off-brand Wonder Woman, this one will just be off-brand Batman, and so on. But then at the very end, the guy who's clearly supposed to be Superman goes and brutally murders the rest of his whole team for unknown reasons. It seems obvious to me that the writers behind Invincible started with a hypothetical question. What if Superman just brutally murdered the Justice League and nobody knew why? And the fact that this scenario would be so shocking and mysterious convinced these writers that it would make a really intriguing premise. So how do you go about doing that if you can't actually use any of those characters? Well, make them spoofs of those characters. In a sense, the only way for the twist to work is to make the team clearly recognizable as the Justice League, because the audience knows the Justice League well enough already that you can utilize all the notions about that team that are already established in the audience's mind. Otherwise, if you tried to build up a new, unique team of totally new, unique characters, it would take a long time to get the audience to feel connected with an understanding of the role of this team to the world and the roles within this team dynamic. You definitely couldn't put this twist at the end of episode 1 without it feeling totally rushed and clumsy. And in a way, I don't think it would even be as effective to go that route. Because the whole point is not to take Superman and make him R-rated and edgy just for kicks, especially because at this point in the lifetime of DC Comics, that wouldn't even come as a surprise. The impact is in taking the concept of the squeaky clean protector of humanity Superman and challenge the notion that humanity even needs such a Superman by presenting the possibility that he could abuse the power he has and destroy us all. The impact is all in what Superman represents as a symbol, not the character himself. Paul serves a similar function, in that it is much heavier to consider his character not just as like, this is what would have happened if Luke had turned to the dark side instead, but rather to truly consider what a chosen one or a messianic figure means as a symbol. To consider what it truly means for anyone to be a symbol of hope. Hope is all we have at our darkest times. Hope is the core of all human endeavor. Hope is what allows us to do anything, to believe in anything. To see a figure who is propped up as a symbol of hope, to see how people like Stilgar are willing to give their lives and lose themselves because they believe so strongly in this hope, and then to see that this beautiful, sacred thing like hope is actually being weaponized, being used to take advantage of and control the people who have nothing but their hope. That's fucking heavy, man. I feel silly when I'm discussing nerdy lowbrow media like some cape shit cartoon for grown-ups as if it's Dostoevsky or something. But I'm more than happy to devote all the time and effort that I have to this Dune discussion, because I believe that we as humans have been using mythology to understand ourselves and our reality since the very beginning. And I believe that mythology still has power and meaning in all of the wildly varied forms it takes. So now let's talk about one of the biggest things from the film that I've seen people getting way too hung up on, in my opinion. I've seen a lot of people on TikTok discussing, or sometimes more like arguing, about the validity of the prophecies made by the Bene Gesserit. I don't ever want to make anyone feel dumb for not catching a certain nuance in a story. So I don't want to denigrate anyone who watched this movie and took the prophecies at face value. Granted, it is both heavily implied and explicitly said in both Dune Part 1 and Part 2 that these prophecies are Bene Gesserit propaganda. But even then, I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt because I know it can be easy to miss things in films sometimes. I do it too, more often than I'd like to admit. Not to mention, I don't think it's quite the checkmate you think it is to say, yeah, they literally said that. I bet you feel so dumb right now. Because often in stories, a character will literally say something and it's not meant to be taken at face value as a true fact. I don't feel that's the case with the Bene Gesserit propaganda thing in Dune. I feel that it really is propaganda. But I still wanted to bring that up because I've seen a lot of people online saying crap like this as a way of posturing their own media literacy, and I think anything that's said for the purpose of shutting down a conversation and trying to make the other person feel inept is usually antithetical to good discourse, as well as just something that makes you seem like a bit of an asshole. Be that as it may, they did literally say that the prophecies are Bene Gesserit propaganda. So moving forward with this discussion, I'm going to proceed assuming that this is the case. Now we get to the part which I think people are really getting too hung up on, which is trying to reconcile in their heads with how the prophecies are propaganda when in fact these prophecies do actually happen. Some people are just legitimately confused, and that's totally fine. But some people are treating it like they're pointing out cinema sins, as if to say, well, if Paul isn't actually the Lisan al-Gaib, then why does he know how to wear the still suit? Why does he ride the sandworm? Why does he survive the water of life? All these things were prophesized, thus making it seem as if those prophecies must actually be quote-unquote real and not quote-unquote fake. As if Frank Herbert or Denis Villeneuve must have not thought all this through properly. Because if they had fully thought it through, these prophecies should not have been fulfilled in the story if the intended purpose was to construct Paul as a false prophet. Personally, I think the thing that people are getting too hung up on is this issue of whether the prophecies are quote real or quote fake. I don't think it needs to be this strict one or the other, either or dichotomy. Allowing some ambiguity, exploring that ambiguity, that's actually part of why Dune is so well written. As opposed to a flaw in its writing, a story of lesser quality and depth would probably do some lame, dumbed-down thing, where Lady Jessica is feeding Paul lines to say through a little earpiece, or we see some behind-the-scenes trickery where a covert team is wounding the sandworm right before Paul rides it, to make it easier for Paul to subdue. Much like the Fremen and the story of Dune itself, the conversations online are now also getting so wrapped up in these petty arguments about whether Paul is or is not the Lisan al-Gaib, that they're too distracted by that to ask the real question, which is, does the Lisan al-Gaib even exist? We see this kind of manufactured controversy in real-world politics and media all the time, and it truly is incredibly effective at, for one thing, keeping people divided, because there's legitimate power in a unified front on any given cause, but also simply being so contentious for no good reason that we lose sight of larger problems worth actually being upset about. The fact that we're all arguing about it online makes it all the more believable and true to life that the people of Arrakis could also get swept up in the ordeal of trying to verify whether this intriguing new persona is their foretold savior or just another wannabe pretender, instead of confronting the idea that nobody is coming to save them. And all of this was made up for the purpose of making them less willing to fight to be their own saviors, and therefore make them easier to control by the time that meticulously constructed figure finally comes around. Chani's point of view is so important because she's apparently the only person that understands this and sees through the bullshit. We see this most clearly in exchanges like when Paul asks Chani, "So you don't believe in the Lisan al-Gaib?" And Chani answers, "We believe in Fremen." Chani's friends say amen to this, but I'm focusing on Chani alone because as the film progresses, that's when it starts to seem the most like she's apparently the only person, visually represented quite overtly by shots like the one where everyone is bowing before Paul except her. In this same exchange, she follows with saying one of the most thematically important lines, which is so crucial to understanding Dune's message. You want to control people? You tell them that a Messiah will come, and then they'll wait for centuries. Of course Paul is the true Lisan al-Gaib, because Paul Atreides was designed to be the Lisan al-Gaib. Or rather, it would be more apt and more interesting to say the Lisan al-Gaib was designed to be Paul Atreides. Another reason the prophecies function so effectively as brainwashing is because they create this inflated sense of importance about criteria and metrics for evaluating one's qualification to lead, based on factors which would otherwise be completely irrelevant, sort of moving the goalposts, if you will. Like now everybody's saying, well, he can't be the Messiah if he can't ride the big sandworm, because the prophecies say that the Messiah will be able to ride the big sandworm. So then, when Paul does ride the big sandworm, everybody takes that as further confirmation that he is in fact their Messiah. But meanwhile, they've lost sight of a very important question, which is, what the hell does riding a big sandworm have to do with leading millions of people to their salvation? Chani does see through the bullshit of the prophecies, but she is herself a part of the prophecies. Because of this, she's not able to fully trust Paul and believe that they can ever live happily ever after, without that always weighing on her mind. She knows deep down that she is right to be distrustful, that she is right to stay away from Paul. But even despite all that, she's still willing to make herself vulnerable to the outcome of being manipulated and hurt, a courageous and self-sacrificial act which she does purely out of her love for Paul. And then she still ends up being hurt, and all of her worst fears that she had all along get confirmed. This is what makes their love story so painfully heartbreaking, especially because we see firsthand how Chani cares for Paul. She takes care of him in all of these adorable little ways. She translates for him when nobody asked her to do that. She defends him when her friends make fun of him. She goes after him when Stilgar sends him into the desert. Through all these little acts of service and caretaking, we see that she truly loves Paul. Like I mentioned earlier, this works well because this kind of thing is a staple of romance fiction, which many people consume addictively. They eat this shit up. I eat this shit up. It foreshadows their romance in almost an enemies to lovers, tsundere, flirty kind of way. Whenever we see Chani doing things to take care of Paul while still blushingly denying having feelings for him, there is an addictive, popcorn-munching thrill in seeing cutesy, wholesome flirtation like this on screen or on the page, and getting all giddy and kicking our little feet about it. It's cute. But I would argue it's not only cute, but also a good thing for us to see as humans, because it gives us examples of how caring for someone and loving someone can be present in the little things someone does. That allows us to hopefully start recognizing the ways that we are loved, the ways we love and can love others, to see the love that is all around us all the time. We'll start to see it in the way an old man still holds the door for his wife, but it's even better when it's something personal to her. The way you catch a glimpse of her portrait front and center in his wallet as he's shuffling to pay the cashier. But the best examples are actually the many things that you couldn't possibly know, since you don't know these people, and you would have to know them to understand. But you can guess and you can hope and daydream about it anyways. You can imagine that maybe he's wearing those chunky orthopedic shoes even though he feels embarrassed in them, because he would rather be able to keep up with his wife as they're walking together, and not slow her down. And that's more important to him than appealing to his own sense of stubborn old man pride and vanity. The women in the audience, including me, including my mom, were all successfully fan-serviced by including a good romantic arc, and then pissing us off so much that now we have to buy a ticket to Dune Messiah, because we have to see if this prick gets what's coming to him. Well done, filmmakers. You have secured the female demographic. I joke, but I also genuinely feel that there's something cute, something that makes you feel comforted and hopeful when you see Chani and Paul flirting. It taps into the whole appeal of romance fiction, which is its ability to make you believe in love. It's not only important to believe in love, but it's also something many people are desperate to see validation of, and therefore confirm their belief in. Even if they know that validation is fictional, and so therefore it is still a belief left unconfirmed, factually speaking. But that's okay, because the belief in the idea is still the most important thing to keep alive. There's something about the female mind which is drawn to this kind of story, and stereotypically always has been. It doesn't mean that she can't also become the hero of her own story, which this movie demonstrates. But it's not just women. Everybody wants to believe in love. But I'm very curious about how a genuinely not toxic, not shallow, emotionally mature, loving, sweet, kind-hearted, romantic man views this film. Excuse me for being sappy for a moment. But I don't have to imagine too hard, because I was able to catch a glimpse into that viewpoint based on my husband's reaction to the film. I sensed that he seemed noticeably saddened by the scene when Chani revives Paul with her tears. And sure enough, his explanation for why the scene moved him and became one of the most powerful scenes in the movie for him is because he had truly empathized with and cared about Chani's perspective and her journey as a person. The male gaze is still pervasive throughout cinema, and there is still a need for bringing a feminist lens into filmmaking, a need to have more women in filmmaking, period. But I think it's important to remember that it isn't all doom and gloom. It's important to point out and celebrate any little moment that reminds us of that. As a woman watching Dune Part 2, a pretty obvious takeaway would be to say that all men are monsters, because just look at what Paul does to Chani, that bastard. But I'm not going to play the bitter man-hater coming to you with my scathing feminist critique of this film. And that's because it actually made me feel comforted and hopeful knowing that two men wrote this version of Chani, that the man I'm married to was able to empathize with and appreciate Chani on a human-to-human level, that my little brother bought me the Art and Soul of Dune books because he knew how much I loved this movie and he wanted to support his sister in writing this essay. I know that things are still bad when it comes to gender politics and how that's represented in media culture, and it could certainly get much, much better. But I also think it does more harm than good to demonize the whole male population in discussions like this. Writing good female characters is of crucial importance because failing to do so perpetuates unrealistic standards and corrupts men's view of women, and women's views of themselves and other women. But failing to do so is also very damaging to men because it deprives them of the chance to see and learn to appreciate women as real, whole, unique people. And that interferes with their own chance to respect, value, befriend, or love a woman for exactly who she is. If a boy grows up only ever watching movies, TV shows, and anime which hypersexualize and objectify women, it's possible that he might miss out on finding his soulmate because he got scared away by something superficial, like if she forgot to shave her legs that morning, if she has a little extra fat around her waist, or if she got a little too worked up about something that seems trivial to him. I should point out, this isn't just about them being deprived of the chance to potentially find their soulmate. It's also depriving them of the chance to learn from female mentors, to laugh at the jokes of their hilarious female friend, to recognize and appreciate the experiences of people like their mother, their sister, or any woman they interact with in their daily life. I made sure to run this by my husband before sharing this because I know that it might make him feel self-conscious, and I know that it wouldn't be his fault if he did feel that way, because society has taught men that they're not supposed to show sincerity and empathy. But that's exactly the reason why I think it's so crucial for men and women alike that we all seek to create a healthier, more open discourse about how both men and women and the relationships between them are represented in our culture and in the media. Everyone would benefit from us doing this, not just men, not just women. I have to give my husband credit for his insightful take on the Desert Spring Tears scene. When I came out of the theater the first time we watched it, after we'd watched it with his friends, we were all standing in the lobby of the AMC chatting about this film, and I made fun of this scene, saying that it was my least favorite because I found it cheesy and cliche. Like, we've seen the magical tears bringing someone back to life trope a million times. I made a joke like, for God's sake, the same thing happened in the SpongeBob SquarePants movie. But when my husband and I were driving home, he explained that he actually found that scene very impactful. When I asked him to explain to me why he felt that way, I was super impressed with his observations about the scene that, admittedly, had totally gone over my head. Initially, my justification for how the scene might have a deeper meaning is that shedding a tear has more significance in Fremen culture, because it's viewed as a personal sacrifice and even taboo to give up any moisture. I'm not saying that I literally think it was some painful sacrifice for Chani to give up one drop of moisture for Paul, since it's not the same as like donating an organ or something. What I mean is that there is a symbolic gravitas to the act of shedding a tear for someone that is different in Fremen culture than it is in our own world. But my husband said that the reason he found this scene so moving is because of how it showed that Chani was powerless over her place within this prophecy. And it's brutal to see Chani's full comprehension of this total powerlessness. For the entire film up to this point, we've seen how passionately she criticizes and resists against the prophecies. We know that she truly, deeply hates these propagandic stories. She has a true, deep hatred for the way that these tales blinded her people and made them weak and vulnerable to exploitation. She has a true, deep hatred for the way that she sees the love of her life slipping away from her, being manipulated by those around him, and losing his own soul, all because he's supposedly the chosen one. These prophecies are ruining her life, and she has always had to watch in disgust and terror as they wreak havoc on the world around her. And recently, it's gotten to the point where she doesn't even have the small comfort of commiserating about this and feeling validated in this hatred by anyone around her. because she's had to helplessly watch as all of her friends and the man she loves gradually give in to the temptation to believe that maybe these prophecies do kind of make a compelling point. She has had to watch helplessly as everyone around her drinks the Kool-Aid, and she is desperately pounding her fists and screaming, begging them to stop. But it's like they just don't hear her. They just won't listen to her. And sticking with the drinking the Kool-Aid analogy, now she has to walk into this temple and discover the love of her life laying there on the verge of death, because the damn fool went and poisoned himself, all because his literal witch of a mother told him he should, because he was pressured into believing he had to, because it's the only way to try to fix this broken world they live in. All of that is way more than terrible enough as it is. But remember that Chani is someone who has always lived in a world that is crumbling around her. She has always had to fight to survive, to fight for the freedom of herself and her people. Chani has that unbreakable fighter's spirit. It's her defining characteristic. No matter how bad things get, the one thing that Chani will always have is her will to fight. And as long as she has that, all hope is not lost. As long as she has her own free will, she will never stop fighting. Fighting with all her blood, sweat, and tears, to stand for what she believes in and to make her world a better place. We witness that free will being violently ripped away from Chani. This is someone who has always known that no matter how dire the situation, there will always be something she can do about it, because she would always still have her indomitable spirit. But now, she's forced to acknowledge that the prophecies she hates with such a passion are happening, right now, right in front of her. And worse, she is a part of those very prophecies, and she can do nothing about it. With my husband's interpretation now in mind, it made me realize that maybe this scene was intentionally playing with that magical tears trope. What I mean by this is that maybe it makes it even worse for Chani, specifically because she's being forced to do something that feels so dumb to her. So melodramatic and contrived. Knowing Chani's character, I can imagine her feeling that this is some lame fairy tale, true love's kiss kind of crap. This is someone who resents her own name because of its association with the prophecies. And now here she is being forced to play her part in that prophecy because of the man she loves, the man she gave her trust to, a man who just willingly poisoned himself because of these stupid stories. And now, through gritted teeth, she must accept that she no longer has control of even her own body, as it leans in for that stupid true love's kiss. Of course that would be devastating for Chani. How could it be anything other than totally devastating? I don't want to go too over the top with making an analogy to Chani as a girl who feels foolish for trusting and then getting her heart broken by some fuckboy. But I also can't help but draw the parallel here that a lot of the advice, complaints, and general commentary you'll hear surrounding crappy relationship dynamics, and messy breakups in particular, has something to do with this idea of shedding tears over someone who doesn't deserve that, who isn't worth your tears. For example, people will say things like, "This is the guy you're crying over?" Or, "I can't believe all the tears I wasted on that loser." Chani is strong and capable. She would have been fine if Paul had never been a part of her life. She'd probably be much better off, in fact. So now for her to find herself crying over a man because she no longer has any choice, the pain of that would be indescribable. When you love someone very much and you are also a fairly astute, level-headed person, sometimes you really can see the writing on the wall before they do. Warning them that something bad could happen might be annoying for them, but it usually still comes from a place of love. It's an expression of your own terrible fear and anxiety for them that you wouldn't feel unless you cared for that person. And there is something uniquely devastating about having one of your deepest fears confirmed. When it was something you kept trying over and over to trust wouldn't happen, despite your instincts and your better judgment. It's awful to be blindsided by a slap in the face that you never saw coming. But there's also something uniquely agonizing and humiliating about having to stand still and simply watch as you allow a slap in the face to happen to you. There's something uniquely tragic about the moment when you have to say, "I knew this would happen." Chani knew this would happen. She warned Paul about it all along. The fact that she is now here in this situation, the fact that Paul has now made her feel like a fool, the fact that she is forced to regret and feel foolish about her actions, when the only mistake she ever made was loving him, truly breaks my fucking heart for Chani. Like I've said, I believe Chani is the true moral hero of the film once it becomes undeniable that Paul is not the person we should be rooting for in this story. Paul ascends to power by convincing his followers to trust and believe in him. And even Chani can't help but fall in love with him, although she knows she probably shouldn't. It's not because Chani is naive or gullible. In fact, it's because she's so capable at seeing through the bullshit that Paul's betrayal cuts even deeper. We know it must have taken so much for her to allow herself to trust him. This brings me from that heavy, serious point to a rather silly point, but I want to mention that I feel the casting for the main roles in this film was just about perfect. Timothée Chalamet was an ideal choice for Paul for many reasons. Whenever an actor is particularly well casted for a role, or sometimes particularly poorly casted, I'll sometimes draw connections to other roles they've played that might have potentially led the casting directors to make that decision. I think Timothée Chalamet as Paul makes a lot of sense based on the 3 other main roles that I think of him in. I thought he was heartbreaking in Beautiful Boy, and that's also a story about a young man who is led astray and leaves a wake of destruction and sadness behind him. Incidentally, both are as the result of developing a harmful dependency on a substance, but that's more just a coincidence, since I think the more meaningful parallel to point out is the character's study of someone who tragically ruins themselves, as opposed to trying to point out that spice and heroin are both drugs, technically. I also thought he was incredible in The King, and that's probably the most obvious comparison to make from his previous roles, since he plays a young leader confronting the perils of his ascension to power and whatnot. But the other role I think of him in is Lady Bird. I think Timothée Chalamet is so perfect for the weirdly specific typecasting of being that guy that a girl can't help but fall for, despite being a very smart and shrewd girl otherwise. But then she really regrets it and feels like such an idiot after he breaks her heart because, oh my god, the signs were there all along that obviously he is such a fuckboy. No offense to Chalamet, but he does totally exude this vibe, where you do get the sense that there is something very sweet and sincere about him, but simultaneously, he looks very much like you might catch him making thirst trap videos. He just kind of has that look about him. And again, no offense to him, because I'm sure he's probably a nice guy. I honestly mean it as a compliment, I guess, because I think that look and persona is sorta exactly what you need for this incarnation of Paul Atreides. I mentioned earlier that there is such a high level of artistry involved in figuring out how to communicate concepts efficiently, especially in a film like this, and I've only discussed that in the context of writing and direction mostly, but the entire crew that worked on this movie absolutely nailed it. I also don't want to minimize the achievements of the actors. Specifically when it comes to communicating things to the audience, the actors really do contribute in an indispensable way. I was particularly impressed with all the moments in this movie when complex emotional messages are communicated with merely a look. Of course, books can handle this through description, and in some cases, maybe books are better suited to handling this, especially because it can be easy to misinterpret these nonverbal cues. But personally, I would argue that this can be a shortcoming of books, and as someone who has dabbled in trying to write fiction myself, this is something I often get frustrated with. For one thing, whenever I have to do that, I find myself sitting at my desk trying to act out the description so I can figure out how to put it into words. And that makes it pretty embarrassing to write around other people. It's also frustrating because we simply don't have sufficient language to describe this, so we often fall to the aid of cliches and idioms that wind up sounding pretty lame. His smile became a straight line, her cheeks turned bright red, that kind of thing. On the flip side, sometimes these descriptions stand out as being particularly well written because it's like, yes, that's such a perfect way to describe that. But even in those cases, it can become distracting. Only through actually filming a person's face can you get that purity, that simplicity, of instantaneously communicating so much through one brief, silent look. I don't know if you're even watching the drawing portion of this video, but you may have noticed that out of all of the stunning visuals of striking landscapes and otherworldly production design, the 2 fan art pieces I've chosen to focus on are close-ups of one character's face. I'm in the process of writing a script for a different video related to my art-making journey that includes quite a long digression about facial expressions and capturing someone's personality through portraiture. Hopefully that'll be up soon. Zendaya does really well with these little micro-expressions. The final shot of the film is just a slow zoom on Chani's face seething with spite and determination, and it's incredible. You can see she's fighting back tears as her eyes glisten and her jaw trembles. At first I found some of her expressions to be not quite micro enough, and I kind of felt the Disney Channel influence bleeding into her performance, but I've changed my mind on that. Because I'm realizing that she simply has a highly expressive face, and that's actually a very beneficial thing for this character. In most of the scenes she's in, there's some example of how her face tells the story. I seriously mean that, and I feel like I could go one by one and analyze what all of the facial expressions of Chani are saying. But I'll stick to this one example. When Paul and Chani are having a bit of an argument, and Paul complains about how she'll never fully trust him no matter what he does, Chani replies, "Because you're a foreigner." And then it's almost like you can see her realization that she went too far. But there's also a tinge of legitimate surprise in this realization, which I believe is her being surprised to see that Paul is genuinely hurt by what she said. I believe she may have forgotten that she's capable of hurting him. Notice how she never uses this to her advantage. In fact, I believe she tries to comfort him and apologize by saying something that isn't even necessarily 100% authentic to how she feels. She answers, "Not to me." I feel like she does still view him as a foreigner in some regard, especially now that Gurney has come and reminded her of the similarities between Paul and Gurney. It's like she was caught up in this wonderful honeymoon phase, and then the arrival of Gurney reminded her to put her guard back up. This is the major wedge in their relationship at this point, the fact that no matter what Paul does, she will always be distrustful of him. And unfortunately, she has good reason to be that. I said, notice how she never uses this to her advantage. And that probably sounded odd because it's like, well, yeah, she would have to be a pretty awful person to use his emotions to her advantage. But remember what film this is. The Bene Gesserit have made an empire out of doing exactly this. The whole concept of the voice is based on this idea. Even outside of Bene Gesserit business, we see emotion and sentimentality being used to convince quite a bit. Gurney and Jessica both tend to bring up Leto whenever they're trying to convince Paul he needs to do something. That's kind of shitty of them if you think about it, because they know that despite all of Paul's competency, he's still just this scared, sad kid who recently lost his dad, and he's desperate to figure out who he is, his way in the world, and now all of that is influenced by trying to figure out how to honor his deceased father through those choices. With that in mind, it also makes it feel a little pathetic and slimy, the way that Stilgar is trying to get close to this messiah figure by acting father-like. Keep in mind, I'm not saying any of these characters are necessarily doing this intentionally. Even the Harkonnen, with all of their brute force and lack of a delicate touch, understand the power of emotionally charged persuasion, because otherwise the Baron wouldn't have orchestrated that whole publicity stunt with the gladiator tournament for the purpose of transforming Feyd's public image. When considering the question of why Dune was considered unfilmable, the most common answer seems to be that the novel relies heavily on interiority, or internal monologue. From what I remember, that's totally true, and that's why it becomes so crucial that the actors are able to convey what's being felt and what's on their minds, even when they can't say it out loud. I'm not an actor, so I don't have a clue, but I would assume it would be insanely difficult to nail the subtleties of scenes when you're portraying a character who isn't exactly being entirely upfront and authentic about how they're feeling. This is a challenge when writing dialogue as well. How can you get the audience to notice that a character is being a little duplicitous without making it so obvious that it seems stupid for the other characters not to pick up on the duplicity? Dune is a story full of plans within plans, and tons of conflicting, complex motivations that also shift around and change quite a bit as the story progresses. Even after doing an intense study of this film, I still find Paul and Jessica in particular to be ambiguous and tricky to pin down exactly. I have a general impression of their characters, but there are still plenty of moments when I can't tell how much of what they say and do is sincere as opposed to being guided by ulterior motives. In a novel, you have the benefit of all the interiority you could possibly want, but in films you don't have that luxury, unless you want to do the thing Lynch's Dune does, and just use tons of voiceover narration to hear all of the characters' thoughts. Needless to say, I don't think that's an ideal solution. The idea of any piece of art getting a reputation for being unadaptable is fascinating, because in order to make that claim, it's necessary to come to a lot of conclusions about the formal aspects of the two different mediums in question. What's something that you could only do in a book? What's something that you could only do in a video game? What's something you could only do in a film? The answers to those questions are valuable because I feel that can provide an interesting place to start when coming up with story ideas within those mediums. For example, if you want to make a comic book but you don't know where to start, why not try to focus on maximizing and making the most out of the specific affordances of that medium? Ask yourself, what is a story that could only be possible to tell in the form of a comic book? Whatever answer you come up with, what's cool is that somebody can easily come around and prove that answer to be wrong, just as Villeneuve has done with Dune. I believe that in order to truly push the limits of art, it's not about constantly trying to one-up each other with disturbing the comfortable and comforting the disturbed, or whatever that dumb saying is. I believe we push the limits of art by stepping up to difficult challenges like this. Challenges such as figuring out how to maximize the potential of a certain medium, or how to adapt something that is supposedly unadaptable. I would like to believe that I'm a fairly media literate person, but there are still plenty of times when I've been watching a movie and someone else will tell me, yeah, they just said that earlier. Sometimes I'm honestly just spacing out, but often the reason I'm not paying full attention is because I'll still be thinking about something in a previous scene. Arguably, that's a shortcoming of film, in contrast to traditional print literature. It might even have something to do with the bias that some people have that reading books is for smart people, and watching movie and TV is for all the dumbasses. I think that's a totally unfair, pretentious bias, but I think maybe that bias comes from the following notion. If you think about it, it seems natural that people would, on average, engage in critical thought about books more than films, because to actually engage in that thought and fully process and develop those thoughts takes processing and development time. Don't pretend it doesn't. Don't act like you're some kind of super genius who doesn't require petty things like time to form conclusions. Frankly, I'm pretty sure that's more of a sign that you're coming to hasty conclusions and you lack the patience to truly sit with something for an extended duration. Movies go a lot faster than books, and unless you're doing a deeper study of the film, it's unlikely that you're going to watch a movie by pausing and or rewinding every beat and every scene. Whereas with books, it's so much easier to do that since you can go at your own pace, which is why I think it's not anything to be ashamed of if you're a quote-unquote slow reader and if it takes you quite a while to get through a book. But in a film, it's necessary to understand that the viewer is not going to sit there and pause the movie every time they need a second to process everything. For that reason, it's vital to give the viewer plenty to think about and stimulate their senses with, but not too rapidly that they start to feel overwhelmed, or that they start to feel so preoccupied with what happened in the previous scene that they can't focus on the current scene. Another aspect that makes book-to-film adaptation difficult is that even with the great advances in our technology, it's still a challenge to live up to what the imagination is capable of. You run the risk of disappointing people. It's very easy to make something on screen look just fucking dumb, especially when the viewer is comparing it to the idealized version they have in their heads. That leads me to additional intriguing little hypothetical questions. What makes something difficult to depict through film, specifically because it's a challenge to make it not feel lame? Or even more directly, what makes something feel cool in a book but lame in a movie? One thing that comes to my mind is the action in a book. This was something I was thinking about during the duel between Feyd and Paul. I kept thinking about how much pressure that would be on the actors. This is the big, exciting climax of the film, the final showdown, and if they didn't perform the fight choreography perfectly, it would be really easy for that to have felt awkward and anticlimactic. Special effects and production design are probably the very most obvious things that might end up looking lame in a film compared to what's imagined in the book. Especially in sci-fi and fantasy, where there are strange, magnificent creatures, alien worlds, magical objects and abilities, and futuristic technology. The space travel in Dune comes to mind in a big way, because I don't even know how the hell you would begin to translate the way that works into cinematic format. It literally requires folding space. No matter how good the special effects are, I don't even know if human beings are capable of really understanding what that would be like. We can use our imaginations to come up with some placeholder visualization of it, but that's different from actually comprehending it and feeling what it would feel like to do that, as a film would ideally want to achieve. This is also an intriguing example example because it's such an abstract, nebulous, cosmic thing that every reader is probably going to have a different mental model of how they conceptualized the space travel whenever they were reading those parts of the book. And so therefore, whatever way it was represented in the film, there would still be tons of people left feeling like that aspect wasn't adequately captured, all because it looks different than how they imagined it. And that's not even getting into the mentats, and how to cinematically represent the way that they use their spice-fueled near-omniscience to navigate. That's a concept which seems so fascinating when you read about it and can use your imagination to conjure up a mental picture of it. But cinematically, it's probably going to end up looking ridiculous. I'm sure Villeneuve would have come up with something better than this, but I'm laughing at the image which just came to my mind of Stephen McKinley Henderson taking basically a fat bong hit, and then his eyes roll back in his skull and he convulses as an image of a galaxy gets superimposed over his face and trance music starts blasting. The shields have also become a popular talking point in this regard. They're shown minimally, especially in part 2, but the shields are still often discussed because they've gained quite a reputation from Lynch's version, due to the amount of work that the animators put into getting that effect. For those out there who think that the Roblox armor in the Lynch version looks stupid, it's become a prime example of the sentiment, you did all that work for this? Of course, even if they aren't shown on screen too prominently, the shields are still important. And you see the implied effects of their existence in every shot, because the existence of the shields has changed the entire way that combat works in this universe. Furthermore, you actually sort of see it in the whole movie, even if it's not a fight scene, because having this technology changes the way that people act and the choices they make, which then has effects on everything else. For example, the whole reason that the Baron lived and Leto didn't is because in part 1, the Baron was comfortable getting right in Leto's face, since the Baron knew he could just pop up his shields if things got dicey. Villeneuve often incorporates the shields for the purpose of highlighting the Harkonnens' honorless power. The Baron rides around in a glorified Walmart scooter, and if he fought Oscar Isaac man-to-man, he'd get obliterated. So he has to confront Leto only when Leto has been presented to him poisoned, weak, and naked. And the Baron still shows up with a shield at the ready, just in case. It shows the tenacity of the Atreides that Leto still went for it, even while poisoned, weak, and naked. He still does try to kill the Baron, and takes down quite a few guards with him in the process. Another thing is that I think the shields in this version of Dune are actually the perfect example of how Villeneuve actually can be really great at show don't tell when he wants to be. This kind of goes back to the thing I mentioned earlier about how it might seem like using tropes is talking down to your audience, but it's actually the opposite, trusting them to be smart enough to piece ideas together based on their knowledge from other media. Similarly, there are other little shortcuts, heuristics, gimmicks, whatever you want to call it, that do the same kind of thing. It definitely seems like talking down to your audience to literally color code something for them. Red is bad. Danger, death. Blue is good. Safety, protection. But I think giving the shields this color coding was actually pretty ingenious because by doing so, we didn't have to have it explained to us how the shields work. And we also didn't have to have it explained to us every time a blow was either blocked or made it through. I also appreciated this because movies and TV have a tendency to make it pretty unclear what is and isn't a fatal wound, often in ways that feel unrealistic, because it's either like, no way could somebody survive that, or wait, that character can't be dead now. Walk it off, you're fine. This is something Dune Part 2 is a little guilty of, actually, because apparently Paul knows exactly where to stab someone to mortally wound them, but Feyd doesn't. Because films are not literally immersive, a major obstacle is that the viewer cannot feel the danger and bodily harm of these life and death combat scenarios. It's good that we can't, obviously, but the sense of risk, the stakes, the death or survival of major characters, conveying all of that clearly is key to giving the viewer that adrenaline rush of well-established tension and drama. So naturally, it takes away from that tension and drama if the viewer is confused about how serious a wound is. Sometimes that very confusion can be the thing that's used for dramatic effect, demonstrating that these combat scenarios are so disorienting and hectic that a character could literally not realize right away that they or an ally of theirs are going to die. But otherwise, there's just something about action sequences that are frustratingly difficult for me to follow most of the time. Even when Chani slices her way through those Harkonnen soldiers towards the end of the movie, it was some pretty graceful and dynamic fight choreography, but it also took me a second to even realize it was Chani. Good world building is all about considering these far-reaching implications. It's one thing to come up with the idea of a shield like this, but it's another thing to consider how that would bring a futuristic society back to a medieval form of sword-based combat, or how that technology can be used to support thematic nuances of your characters. such as when Feyd takes off his shield in the gladiator arena. When he does this, you could say it shows that he has a sense of honor, but you could also say he's such a violence-loving adrenaline junkie that he gets his kicks from the thrill of a real fight. Regardless, it establishes Feyd as being more intimidating than the Baron because we see he's not so pathetic and wimpy as to hide behind his shield all the time. You can do world building like this even without coming up with some high concept invention. Even a lack of something can be used in this way. For example, I love how the scarcity of water informs the unique cultural customs of the Fremen. That's the stuff about world building that just gets the little nerd in me bouncing off the walls. It's one thing when a fictional culture or person has a certain quirk for the novelty of it, but it's another, better thing whenever it's not only a novelty but also purposefully informed by the world around them. I was trying to think of a custom from sci-fi or fantasy that I find interesting in itself, but also specifically an example where there isn't a ton of thought put into the reason behind it. The first specific example I could come up with made me laugh, so I'm going to go ahead and include it even though it's stupid, and probably not the right example because it's intentionally stupid. It's a bit. For some reason, the most memorable joke for me out of watching Invader Zim as a kid is the fact that the leaders of Zim's alien race are called the tallest. And then there's that moment of realization where Dib, the human kid adversary to Zim, figures this out and is immediately like, wait, your planet's leaders are just taller than everyone else? That example is obviously played comedically, but sometimes there are customs and quirks invented by anyone from the DM of your local D&D group to the authors of those popular fairy smut books, where a custom will be imagined and then included in the story, seemingly just for the sake of being noticeably different from our world. And the whole appeal is merely that it indicates the fact that what you're seeing is not our world. It's different because they do different things here than we do. I mean, that's fine. That's still just having fun and using your imagination, so I'm never going to bash on that. But what excites me so much more and makes the story feel so much more real is when it's apparent that these quirky fictional concepts don't just exist in a vacuum. They are a part of and have emerged from the specific qualities of the world itself. It feels so much more real because, of course, this is how everything works in our actual reality. Everything exists in a complicated ecosystem of interconnection to everything else. This is actually a pretty relevant topic in a discussion about Dune because so much of Frank Herbert's inspiration for writing this came from his fascination with ecology. My theory about why Dune felt so fresh and original at the time it was published, and why it still stands up as such a classic, is because Frank Herbert didn't just do the expected standard thing that everyone else was doing at the time. Most other sci-fi writers got into it because they had been inspired by other sci-fi novels, because they knew the genre was gaining popularity and they wanted to play their part in that growing genre. When Frank Herbert talks about what inspired him to write Dune, he doesn't mention anything like that. He just talks about how much he loves the desert. And I think that's freaking awesome, honestly. You do run into a potential issue when you write things like this into your story, and put such emphasis on the minutiae of all the possible implications that derive from the existence of this thing. People will inevitably postulate about implications that you had not intended. For example, I keep getting recommended this YouTube video that has millions of views with a clickbaity thumbnail that says something like, "The Gross Secret of Dune." And there's a little stink cloud coming off of Chani and Paul. And I'm just like, I don't even need to click on this. I already know that this video is going to be about how nasty and smelly you would get living in the desert wearing a still suit you never take off that recycles your sweat perpetually. Even I got pretty grossed out during the scene in part 1 when they're making coffee with a group of people all spitting into a big communal spit bucket. So there are definitely implications emergent from the particular ecology of Arrakis that didn't exactly create that "I'm dying to know more" effect in me. But I still loved everything with the idea of a holy site which contains a giant pool of the water of the honored departed souls. That is such a concept. I also enjoy how water often takes on an allegorical importance for the purpose of making social commentary about the people in this world. For example, in part 1, there are those trees that each get enough water for multiple men, but these trees get watered nevertheless. I straight up cackled at the moment from part 1 when Stilgar spits at Leto, and the guards get ready to pounce because they think Stilgar is showing disrespect. But then Duncan steps in to explain it actually means the opposite in Fremen culture. When I was sitting in the theater next to my mom, she asked a bewildered, "What are they doing to him?" when they started draining the moisture from that Harkonnen soldier. And then there was another example a few minutes later. I think it might have been the Thumpers, and I got the urge to explain, but I realized she was probably able to figure it out using context clues. That got me thinking, why am I acting like I'm an authority on this alien tech? Why am I acting like I know what it does in the same way I know what a lint roller does, or a doorknob, or some other totally mundane object in our world? It's crazy how quickly you can accept the existence of something that doesn't exist as long as the story does a good job of making it feel believable. It can become cheesy quickly, and it's often used for low-effort little jokes, but there's a lot of opportunity for amusing fish-out-of-water moments that deal with the idea of unfamiliar objects and concepts. You know, when an alien character can't understand something that we view as obvious, and then they use it incorrectly, but it's endearing. Think Starfire, George of the Jungle, Ariel using a fork as a comb. Dune Part 2 doesn't really do much of this for comedic effect, besides maybe Gurney blasting air in his face when Chani says, "Look at him, he's hopeless." I'd argue that the heavily memed, "May thy knife chip and shatter" moment is also abstractly an example, since my interpretation is that Feyd was completely oblivious to the context. So he was just like, oh hell yeah, glad to see someone else being mysterious and threatening besides me. When Chani is teaching Paul how to sandwalk and he does the whole, "well actually the videos said" thing, that's an interesting example because it's not that Paul totally misunderstands, but it's his presumption of understanding better than Chani does that becomes the butt of the joke here. But perhaps most interestingly of all, Paul fashioning his stillsuit the Fremen way is the first big indicator we get of the possibility that he is the Messiah. He will know their ways as if they are his own. In this sense, so much of Paul's ability to earn the Fremen's trust has to do with how well he can acclimate into Fremen culture, how well he can avoid seeming like a fish out of water. Paul's status to the Fremen and to Chani as either a foreigner or a Fedaykin, convincing them that he is one of them. This is all very important thematically to the story that Dune tells, and it wouldn't be possible without the world building to back it up. If Arrakis and Caladan were nearly identical from each other, and also not that different from planet Earth as we know it, if the Atreides and the Fremen lived basically synonymous lifestyles, it could be told to us that Paul is trying to acclimate to Fremen life, but it couldn't be shown to us. Herbert is responsible for the vast majority of this, but Villeneuve also did a really good job in translating that to screen. But no matter how well established the world building is, if these are concepts, technologies, and magics that we are unfamiliar with, then it can still be difficult to get the audience to understand and feel the impact which is intended. That's because each person in the audience can only exist within the context of their own mind. With long books, and especially long series of books, long television series, long video games, it can be somewhat possible to immerse yourself fully enough that you feel like you actually live in that world instead of this one. But it's still never going to be an absolute and comprehensive sense of immersion. An author, a director, even an actor is far more immersed in the world and the characters than we are. So sometimes they can even forget that just because they understand what this object or reference means in this context, and feel the whole emotional weight of it immediately, that doesn't necessarily mean the audience will. I personally feel this might be the case with the spice in the water of life. I think we all generally know what it is and what it does, but we've all kind of underestimated the full significance of it because we have no true first-hand experience of it. I find it surprising that we see Paul and Jessica both become radically changed people immediately after drinking the water of life, and in both cases, most of us have been seemingly reluctant to blame it all on the spice. I think the fact that so many people are dismissive of the effects of the spice on the transformation of these characters is a great example of exactly what I'm talking about. The idea that the audience might slightly underestimate the significance of a certain thing because they aren't actually experiencing it. They're merely watching someone experience it on screen. And a psychedelic substance is a perfect example because even when it's mushrooms or something, it's notoriously difficult to communicate cinematically exactly what it's like to have a psychedelic trip to someone who has never done it. Some representations on screen are cheesier and more blatantly misrepresentative than others, but no matter what, it's kind of impossible to capture exactly because it's an ineffable and non-transferable experience. And I feel that spice is to blame in some way. Herbert wrote spice this way knowing that hallucinogenic substances are often very related with mystic tradition. It's ingenious to make the same substance also serve as an allegory for oil, gold, or other valuable resources that empires kill each other over. In our own world, both greed and zealotry have served as triggers for the evil in man. But Herbert envisions a situation in which one substance can be the impetus for both greed and zealotry at the same time. I believe that Paul and Jessica probably weren't entirely pure-hearted to begin with, but I also think it's worth considering that none of us have ever had our psyches torn apart by the burden of near omniscience. I think human beings probably aren't meant to have all of that knowledge. And it probably fucks you up as a person pretty badly to have that suddenly shoved into your brain. I think maybe it's somewhat comparable to Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen. When you can see that big of a picture, I'd imagine how that could create a distanced, abstracted view of humanity, in which the value of individual lives and individual suffering becomes difficult to appreciate. I'm not going to spoil what happens with Dr. Manhattan for those who haven't read Watchmen, but I hope you can see how this view of what it would be like to be godlike in knowledge is understandable, but also probably misguided, and it's probably in everybody's best interest to adopt a viewpoint which sees value and importance in human life. I'm trying to understand Paul's motivations. It's important to remember that he was terrified and had a world of pressure and expectation on his shoulders. That doesn't justify the war crimes that he will later commit, but I'm bringing it up because I disagree with the complaint I've seen online that his decision to go south and drink the worm piss comes out of nowhere. It might have felt slightly rushed due to the aforementioned constraints of adapting something as vast as Dune into a film, but I honestly sort of understand Paul's reasons for doing this. A lot of us can't finish a homework assignment without stimulants to assist us. And we're really questioning why Paul would be tempted by a substance that gives you limitless knowledge, especially when we consider the enormous uncertainty and fear that comes with recognizing that lots of people will die and suffer no matter what you do. And lots of people are looking to you for answers, when all you have are scattered, conflicting fragments of answers. I get so frustrated I want to kick something when I wake up and can't remember a good dream I had. Obviously, I can understand why Paul would be going crazy, feeling like he's so close to an answer, but it keeps eluding his grasp. That would be maddening. In addition to that, you have visions of the guy you killed reciting you poetry about how the best hunters go to the highest peaks so that they can see everything there is to see before they strike. That's a pretty convincing argument. I don't want to get too far into it because this video has gone on for too long already for me to suddenly start indulging in my conspiratorial, clickbaity fan theories. But I do suspect that the Bene Gesserit might be using the voice to control Paul's actions. But I think it's possible that the visions of Jamis aren't Jamis at all, but instead the Bene Gesserit. Most of the things that were said in that vision right before Paul decides to go south are said in the scary whispers of the voice, not Jamis's voice. Similarly, I know some people are getting hung up on the thing with Chani's tears because if the prophecies aren't real, why do her tears successfully revive Paul, as if by magic? But Paul has also learned poison transmutation, and if you listen closely, the scary whisper voice says, "Rise," right before Paul's eyes snap open. I think it's possible that Chani's tears might have actually been about as effective as if you tried to save someone dying from a snake bite by blowing them a little kiss. But the Bene Gesserit might have just made it look like the tears are what revived Paul by commanding him to wake up right at that moment. Alright, that was fun. One more. You want to hear my theory about how the spice might be inherently sinister in nature? In the same way that some non-fictional psychedelic substances on Earth tend to make people euphoric and affectionate, whereas there are some, like salvia for instance, that tend to make people see demons and jump out of windows. Maybe the water of life functions pharmacologically by acting on parts of the brain that should probably be left alone. I know that's probably wrong, but I mean, what if, you know? Frank Herbert said a quote that I find deeply fascinating. The difference between a hero and an anti-hero is where you stop the story. It's funny because I and many other people are chomping at the bit to tell you that Paul is an anti-hero because he goes on to commit heinous war crimes, but only because we know tangentially about Frank Herbert's intention in writing the novel, and we can read the subtext of the film adequately enough to be like, well, I see where this is going. Of course, there are many avid Dune heads who have read all the books and know everything that happens, so they're excluded from this. But for me personally, as well as my brother and my husband and anyone else who loved this film but have not even read Dune Messiah, it's funny to me how willing we are to hold Paul responsible for the 81 billion deaths he eventually causes when we have not seen him do that yet. Is it enough that we know what's going to happen? Villeneuve's take on Dune Messiah hasn't even come out yet. This is different from theorizing about outcomes that are genuinely mysterious, mysteries which are currently ongoing and unanswered. The way I anticipate and postulate about Severance Season 2 is different than my hype for Dune Messiah. Prophecies have become a staple of sci-fi and fantasy because it's so intriguing to imagine the notion of the future being foreseeable. Even if some concept we see in fantasy is magical mumbo-jumbo, that doesn't mean it still can't be grounded in realism. And in fact, most of the best speculative fiction occurs when the author uses the magical mumbo-jumbo thing and asks what would happen if that thing actually existed. If we were to imagine something magical being inserted in a real world with real people, what would be their believable, very human-like reactions to that? When I say real world and real people, note that I could mean something from magical realism, or a subgenre like urban fantasy where the premise actually is, what if there were fairies living amongst us in our modern society, or something like that. But the world could be Middle-earth and the people could be hobbits, as long as it still feels convincingly like it could be a real world and these could be real people. This is where sci-fi as a genre comes in as a natural evolution of the fantasy genre, because it involved people observing that all of our scientific advancements and discoveries are starting to feel a whole lot like magic. And therefore science fiction typically puts an even greater emphasis on the hypothetical aspect, by posing even more relatively plausible scenarios for asking the question, what would happen if this thing existed? And these things really do have an air of plausibility about them even when they're outlandish, because we now live in a world where things that our grandparents thought were impossible are now mundane features of our everyday reality. You may have noticed that I seemingly enjoy taking an extremely high-concept sci-fi fantasy world and pointing out things that kind of remind me of mundane references to everyday life and pop culture. Like, I did that when I called Timothée Chalamet's Paul a fuckboy. It probably pissed some people off when I said that, and I can understand why this is probably an annoying tendency of mine. It's totally deflating something majestic and larger than life, totally taking the wind out of those sails. Why would you want to take something epic and basically just trivialize it and make it seem more like our boring, stupid reality than it was intended to be, needs to be, or should be? Honestly, I don't really know. I don't know why I have this tendency to do that. Most likely, it's just providing some point of reference for myself, some basis of understanding where it becomes easier for me to relate by putting it into terms I'm more familiar with. Like, I don't understand what Paul is going through exactly, literally, because I've never been burdened with being the Kwisatz Haderach. But I do understand what it's like to have a lot of adults telling you that you're going to do great things one day and then freaking out a little bit because of those expectations. It's not the same thing, but it allows for a certain level of sympathy towards an understanding of Paul's character that I maybe wouldn't have otherwise. I don't think it's necessary to do this within your reading of the story. In fact, it's probably inadvisable. It's probably something I should frankly try to do less of. If you project yourself and things within your reality too much into your reading, then you risk letting your own biases lead to inaccurate and unfair interpretations. However, I'd argue that's somewhat unavoidable. On some level, you're always going to automatically do this, because everywhere you go, you bring yourself. Likewise, you bring yourself into that theater, and even the loudest Dolby surround sound doesn't completely drown out your own thoughts. But I also feel like this is actually something that aligns with the world-building advice that a lot of the masters of speculative fiction would give and have given. I've definitely heard creatives give this advice, and I'd cite the quotes or include a clip of the interviews if I remembered who specifically I've heard say this. Help me out in the comments because I'm sure a lot of you have heard this somewhere too. Even if a fictional world looks nothing like real life, you still want the characters to behave like people you might actually meet in real life. You still want the themes to address anxieties and joys, problems and victories that function on a similar emotional level as those you've actually felt or could feel. When I look at Lady Jessica with her tattooed face and her ceremonial garbs, I'm reminded of that viral TikTok of the woman who raps about how she's been learning shit from the aliens, like how we're all connected to the pyramids. For some people, that might totally ruin the character of Lady Jessica. They might hate that I even said that. But for me, I strangely think that makes her character even more interesting, believe it or not. For one thing, because that comparison makes me laugh. And I like to laugh. And not be so damn serious about everything. When Jessica tells people that Aaliyah is asking about something or saying something, I notice that there is no reason for that. She could just as easily frame the question or statement as something she, as Jessica, wants to know or say. It'd be a lot less fucking off-putting to just phrase it that way instead. But then it made me realize she's really playing it up. really leaning into this whole spooky, mysterious matriarch vibe by saying weird shit like that for no reason. Not to mention, when I look at it this way, her arc almost seems like a B-plot from a sitcom like Arrested Development or Always Sunny. Like, I can imagine characters from either of those shows going on a wacky misadventure where they get a little too indoctrinated into a weird cult, and then we see them in ceremonial garbs with arcane symbols tattooed all over their face. And when someone else from the cast confronts them about this, they explain, I don't know, I'm like their Reverend Mother now or something. You're just jealous they didn't pick you. Why can't you just let me have this? Out of curiosity, tell me in the comments which characters from your favorite sitcoms you can most easily see getting Lady Jessica'd. But it's not only worthwhile for me to entertain unconventional takes about media like this because I personally get a kick out of it. Sometimes there's also a deeper meaning that I find in stories, whether it was the authorial intention or not, by following through on the thought process of whatever random crap pops in my mind, instead of immediately disregarding it like, that's weird, that's silly, that's stupid, that's wrong. For instance, seeing Jessica like this became another way that I accessed sincere sympathy for our complicated antihero protagonist. Paul just lost his dad, his home, everyone and everything he knows and cares about. And the only family he had left was Jessica. And now he's basically lost his mom, too. Because she's so far gone now that she's never going to be the same person again. When I see them standing next to each other, Jessica with her cloak and her face tats, I imagine him rolling his eyes and sighing, Mom, you look fucking ridiculous. Will you please take that shit off? We know that it's obviously tragic when someone's loved one dies, but it can be just as tragic when a loved one experiences a spiritual death in which they completely lose the person they once were. Chani's I'll always love you as long as you stay who you are does a much better job of pulling our heartstrings and making us recognize the sorrow of this kind of loss. But this loss is also present in Paul's love for his mother. Paul has lost his mom now because she has lost herself. Overall, I feel that there's so much more you can gain out of the experience of watching any film, reading any book, or experiencing any type of art if you're just willing to have more fun with your interpretations, to think outside of the box a little more, to run the risk of sounding like an idiot because you're willing to truly follow what your heart and your own unique personality tells you. I feel self-conscious about saying this, but honestly, the whole reason I felt it might be worthwhile for me to make this video is because I feel I have unique thoughts and ideas about stuff like this. I'm very aware that what I have to say about Dune or anything I make a video about in the future is not going to be the deepest, the truest, the most insightful, most eloquent, or even the most sensical commentary available about that thing. But I also know that I keep waiting around and failing to do or share any of the work I want to be making because I keep feeling like I'm not good enough yet. But I'm never going to meet this ridiculous expectation of perfection or genius. What I do have right now, just the way I am currently, is myself. Even if I'm not the best or the smartest or the most entertaining, I still have plenty of thoughts and ideas that nobody else has. And so do you. It feels kind of pathetic to admit that the most excited I've felt about anything in quite a while is a popular sci-fi movie. At this point, I've put more time and effort into this video than I ever believed I was capable of putting into one project. If you had told me that after a lifetime of romanticizing, overthinking, and dreading the idea of my first big project, the thing I'd finally commit to would be a film discussion about Dune Part 2, I would have been like, really? Are you sure? Eventually, the whole point kind of became proving to myself that I am actually capable of committing to a big project like this and following through on it. So it doesn't even really matter what that project is about. I'm proud of myself simply for the fact that I kept on riding this particular sandworm for all it's worth, and I didn't let it buck me off. Whenever you get lucky enough to find one of those rare, special things that make you feel alive, and it's not hurting anybody, and it's not hurting yourself, don't fucking question it. For me, right now, it happens to be this popular sci-fi movie about an interplanetary jihad. Oh well. Allow yourself to get really personally invested in something silly, something pointless. If it's working, if it's succeeding and getting you fired up, keep delving into it and pursuing it for as long as you can. If you find a piece of art you like enough to devote countless hours diving into it like I've done here with Dune Part 2, do that. Sure, I put this video here on YouTube because I wanted to show everyone this thing I made, but I'm also posting it here because I want you to get inspired to do something like this yourself. Take something you enjoy, immerse yourself in it, and explore it as deeply as you can. Art is never finished because somebody else can always keep taking inspiration from it, and therefore keep expanding it, keep imagining new extensions upon it. I'll end this video with a quote from Frank Herbert.
Well, let's examine something as far as fiction in general is concerned. Now, there are other reasons why stories are remembered, and I'm talking about story in the classic sense of the jongleur who goes from castle to castle to earn his meal.
All right.
Entertainment.
Sure.
The stories that are remembered are the ones that strike sparks from your mind. Mm-hmm. One way or another. It's like a grinding wheel. They touch you and sparks fly. Now, we all have stories that we go on with after finishing reading them. Mm-hmm. As children, we can remember playing Treasure Island.
Right. Or playing Tom Sawyer.
Or Tom Sawyer. Mm-hmm. Any of these. We remember playing these. The story stayed with us. The characters and their conflicts and their joys, their play, all stayed with us.
And it enkindled sparks in our own imagination so that we were then active in creative play.
That's exactly right. We went on and told the story ourselves.
Yeah.
Now, I deliberately did this in Dune for that purpose. I want the person to go on and construct for himself all of these marvelous flights of fantasy and imagination